Bloomberg SEC
Grab your phone,
CFTC
hit record,
apparently
and let your
Musk
idea
is upping
fly.
the SEC feud by disclosing
The future of your startup could be just one video away.
Let's kick it all off for you, though.
Remember,
with a Bloomberg
be
Business
clear,
Flash, and for
be
that, we go to John
passionate,
Tucker.
and most important,
well off the
be
highs
you.
of the session.
We can't wait to see what you've got. Let's get funded now.
Another record, still up, but not nearly as much. Nasdaq 100 right now up. I see 0.2%, just 33 points right now. I'm looking for a reason why this turnaround. I can't find one just yet. Broadcom, the chip supplier for Apple and some of the other big tech companies, surging to a $1 trillion market valuation for the first time. They are predicting a boom in demand for its artificial intelligence chips. Meantime, Chris Verone at Strategas Securities says, you know what, stocks certainly can push higher.
Well, I think there's clearly this awakening of animal spirits. You see it in the targets. The attitudes from the sell side today are remarkably different than they were a year ago. The street was looking for basically an unchanged S&P in 2024, and what are we up, 25%, right? So there's clearly a resetting of expectations here.
And bond yields climbing today, putting treasuries on pace for their worst week in more than 2 months. Oil also edging higher. WTI crude oil is up about 5% this week. Prospects for tighter U.S. sanctions against Iran and Russia to blame for that. This Bloomberg Business Flash being brought to you by BAM Mutual, insuring municipal bonds that finance essential infrastructure and providing guaranteed income to improve any portfolio. Learn more about municipal bond credit quality. Visit BAMBonds.com. We check the markets. That was lame. We check the markets view all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker at your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex's explanation for the turnaround in the markets was it's Friday the 13th.
I'm actually not entirely
I mean, that's
kidding.
actually not the worst
Insane.
thing I've ever heard.
I mean, also Europe's trading heavy. There was some economic data out from the Bundesbank that was pretty terrible for Germany. So, like, there's some selling pressure over in Europe. But I'm
Germany's got problems.
They have a lot of problems.
I mean, the energy side, on the supply side, arguably their biggest business, exporting this big equipment stuff that they're so good at, and cars to China.
Yeah.
That's
actually, though, what's interesting is that the Bundesbank was talking about Trump tariffs, and they said that if he followed through on his threats to impose 10% tariff on European goods and 60% on Chinese exports, it would knock as much as 0.6 percentage point off of Germany's GDP next year.
just what they need. Okay.
That's huge.
That is big.
I mean,
All right.
yeah, they're already from a low base. So.
Yep. All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney, live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers Studios. John is just reporting a little bit of red on the screen, not much happening out there. But let's see where the news is under the hood. We go to Emily Graffet, cross-asset reporter for Bloomberg News and the pride of Charlottesville, Virginia. Emily, what do you got for us?
Exactly. Well, the major
Wait, are you a
indexes...
UVA person too?
Yes.
Another one.
Yes,
Oh
just
my
like
God.
Norma Linda and Haley
Go to
Lyons.
UVA. Here who's under 30. All right, go ahead.
So the major indexes are in the red, but Broadcom is still higher. And most of those semi stocks are still higher. I think all just off of the good news out of Broadcom. Like John Tucker had said, they are a chip supplier for major tech companies, including Apple, and they're predicting a boom in demand for their AI chips. They said that sales of AI products are going to gain 65% in the fiscal first quarter, which is faster than its overall semiconductor growth. And then they're already posting up the numbers from their AI revenue. So they said that full year 2024 semi revenue was a record $30.1 billion, and that AI revenue grew 220% year on year. So for those chips that they use to power AI processes and devices.
I mean, this isn't like a penny stock
No.
being up, double digits, 20%. I mean, this is a $1 trillion market.
Right.
I mean, I always just marvel at the amount of shareholder wealth that is created or destroyed, depending on some of these big chip names that are having these monster moves like NVIDIA did over the last year and now today with Broadcom.
Right, biggest
real
intraday
money.
gain since 2020.
And here's my question for Broadcom, and we'll get to this later on in the hour too. Is this a rally borrowing from hope from next year's earnings too in 2026, since with the long-term outlook, or is this a rally based on literally the numbers and the growth that they delivered yesterday?
Yeah, right. Well, I guess we'll have to see.
We'll have to see. All right, Costco, what's going on there?
Okay, so I have to admit, I thought that because Costco is a members-only club, that it was not
Lisa
a publicly
Mateo,
traded
big
company, but it is, and its stock is up over 50% year to date, and they in fact report earnings that were pretty good. EPS beat estimates, comp sales, including gas, we're up 3.8% year over year. Actually, slightly missing estimates, but that stock is higher. Total revenue, $62.15 billion, which beat estimates and was up 7.5% year over year.
I'm guessing this means that you've never been to a Costco.
No, I have been to a Costco.
It was public. Okay.
I didn't know it was public. Yeah. I guess my parents are Costco members.
A hot dog and a soda, $2.50.
Is it still $2.50? We've had this conversation.
Yeah, never changing,
Never
the guy
changing.
says.
But
And
then
the
you go
chicken
and
bake. I've had a chicken bake. I've had the berry smoothie.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
It's a thing, man. And people, I mean, Lisa Mateo loves Costco. I mean, she goes in with 2 carts and comes out full.
It's not great for people who live in New York City and don't have a lot of space to have, like,
Right.
you know, like 40 rolls of paper towels in their apartment.
But that moment that you do have that space, it's a solid, good
Straight
moment.
to Costco.
All right, and wrapping it up with Trafigura.
Yeah, one of the top stories on the Bloomberg terminal, Trafigura, one of the largest commodity trading shops, reported a 62% drop in profit. That news coming out today. And this is all related to alleged employee misconduct in its Mongolian oil business. Bloomberg News reporters have been following this for a while. They first reported that they were facing sizable losses in the business in February. And then in October, the company confirmed it had uncovered alleged wrongdoing by its own employees. Apparently, they were manipulating data and documents to inflate the amount of money that it had paid out. And so this all coming to a head this morning when we're now seeing that the drop in profit is a 62% drop from the previous year, the lowest in 4 years, after a big boom in commodity trading that happened post-pandemic.
Yep.
Commodity prices were higher.
Tough comps, yeah.
Now these are tough comps.
All right, thanks so much, Emily. Really appreciate Emily Grafeo joining us, Bloomberg Equities reporter on all things with this moving within the market. Here was a headline that was interesting. Well, I mean, I think for anyone listening, it was interesting. Is that Trump advisors are considering raising salt write-off limit from 10,000 to 20,000. Why not 40,000?
Exactly. Why not just
if you're
eliminate
going to go 20, just move it up there.
How much are your property taxes?
It's a good question. Can you multiply like 14,000? I think.
Wow. Okay.
Is that
that's about around these parts.
Is that a wow nothing? Is that a wow that's not bad?
It depends. You go north of New York City into Westchester, and that's really low. It's like in the 20s for just a regular house.
No, I live in an apartment building.
Yeah.
Like a 1,400 square foot apartment building. And every year I feel like the property taxes goes up. That's when I knew I was an adult.
But you're a hipster. You're in Brooklyn.
I'm in Park Slope. Park Slope is like the non-hipster place. It's where people go to have babies and dogs.
Okay.
Anyway, Henrietta Triss is managing partner and director of economic policy at Beta Partners, and she joins us. How real can we take this salt tease?
Very seriously. So good news for you, for sure. I commiserate with folks who want it larger. This is the minimum I think they have to have for a tax bill to pass next year. The SALT caucus, and indeed a lot of the Republican gains in the House of Representatives, have come from new voters that they're finding in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, California, states where these SALT caps are extraordinarily painful. And the members are being very clear and vocal. They've gotten more and more adamant and united over the last 7 years since this tax bill passed that they have to see a change to SALT if there is any tax title in any legislation going forward. So they'll try to get it in the first reconciliation bill. If there's a second, they'll try to get it into that. And they will threaten their votes, which with a 0 vote margin in the House means that you have to cater to their requests.
Henrietta, can you give us the latest on the expectations for confirmations of some of President-elect Trump's more contentious nominees for cabinet positions? Have we seen any movement one way or the other?
I think we have a long way to go here, and you can see the various factions coming out behind the scenes trying to sink or lift various candidates. One of the things that would make me expect those stories to continue negatively for example, his nominee Hegseth or for Tulsi Gabbard, is that there are other folks waiting in the wings who know that in the event that their nominations fail, they could be the ones to gain. So there's a lot of negativity that you see sort of in the behind the scenes work, specifically on Tulsi Gabbard, I would say, that is going to continue to eat into the next month of the conversation until the negotiations really start and the confirmation hearings start and they get these folks up for a vote in late January. So there's a long way to go. I think Tulsi Gabbard in particular is pretty imperiled right now.
Other news that struck me overnight was the Wall Street Journal reporting that potentially Trump could get rid of the FDIC and put deposit insurance in the hands of Treasury. Now, abolishing a whole unit of the government like that would be very rare. Can you walk me through what you think of that potential?
I don't take those claims particularly seriously. One of the things that we should just keep as our base case is understanding that Congress has the power of the purse. And that is something that the Supreme Court has stress tested in 1974 and in other iterations. Bill Clinton famously tried the line item veto, where he tried to just cancel out entire lines of funding that the federal government or Congress had authorized. It's just not legal. It is unconstitutional and runs afoul of so many different things. Plus, you have a lot of members who get really uncomfortable moving agencies into other auspices. Another example, to pile on the FDIC thing, would be the USTR. President-elect Trump has said that he's going to put U.S. Trade Representative and that office underneath the Department of Commerce. And immediately you see members come out of the woodwork and say, hey, that's not what we're into. That's not what it's supposed to be. Keep these two things separate. That was very similar to what we saw in Trump's first term, and ultimately those did not come to pass.
Elon Musk, Doge. It's been a week or so of, I guess, no news on kind of that front. Is that whole cost-cutting aspect, how should we think about that, and how might that play out in the first 100 days?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about Doge. They can have committee hearings. They can form caucuses in the House and the Senate. They're even bipartisan now in the House. But let's look at what's really happening. They just voted on in the House a National Defense Authorization Act that increases defense spending by 1%. Next week, starting on Sunday, they will roll out a continuing resolution that provides $100 billion in additional funding for hurricanes and typhoons. There is additional aid to Ukraine. There's additional aid to a whole host of factors. And federal spending next year will continue to rise. Whether Doge exists and holds meetings or not, federal spending is going to rise into next year. They'll vote on it as soon as Thursday of next week. You can take that to the bank.
What else are you paying attention to as we head out of 2024 into 2025 as well? Not only from, President-elect Trump, but also President Biden.
The most important thing for me is watching the Senate and the House budget committees. I know it sounds wonky, but this is the single most important thing to watch going into next year. What we've already seen from Senate Republican leadership and new leader Thune is that they are appreciating and expecting for the tax bill to take all year to write. We started off with the SALT caucus conversation. It's because of that $1.2 trillion revenue raiser being completely unpalatable to 18 members of the House that they're going to have to negotiate all year on a tax bill. So what that first tells me is that the deficit appetite for the tax bill is going to be very controversial. It's very problematic, and they want to take that vote much later in the year. They'd like to score some smaller sort of red meat wins on immigration, increasing border spending, increasing energy and oil and gas permitting. That kind of legislation and that strategy is going to come out on January 4th when House Republican leadership has a meeting with the full Republican conference to see if they can tolerate a 2 reconciliation bill strategy or just 1. So the conversations behind the scenes are already taking place there. Investors should be very much following that right now. It has huge implications for tax policy, for immigration, defense spending, deficit spending, bonds, everything happening now.
Henrietta, to what extent, if at all, do folks really, the folks inside the Beltway, the people that are there year in, year out, do they view President-elect Trump as a lame duck president?
I think there's 2 ways of looking at that. One, that you have an impetus to act immediately. So that's really relevant, for example, on the trade front. It takes forever to negotiate with foreign nations. We've seen that from 2017 and 2018. We still do not have a trade agreement with the EU. We do not have a trade agreement with Canada, with China. So I think the trade agencies are going to kick off much earlier in the second Trump term than they did in 2017. That year, we had to wait the full year for the tax bill to be written, and then we could get into the trade universe. This time, I expect the the tariff agencies, USTR, Commerce, BIS, to come out guns blazing immediately. So that's acknowledgement that you only have 4 years to operate, and it takes forever just to hold a meeting with China, to pick out what location you're going to be meeting in, if they'll even come to the table and negotiate with you in the first place. So I think lame duck has a sense of nothing will happen. On the trade front, I think it means everything needs to happen immediately so that you have and are taking advantage of the limited 4 years that you do have.
Which I love how you brought that up, because then it's a sequencing conversation, right? If you have taxes, you have immigration, and you have tariffs, and What's the sequencing of all of that?
Yeah, the sequencing is critical. So the tax bill is not going to be written until the end of the year. The deadline's not until December 31st. They will not do it until year end. Immediately then, you're going to have tariffs. And the tariffs are a massive hit on American consumers. $1.4 billion in real income per month hit from just the existing tariffs. So when we double them and put them at 35%, or higher, 60%, as President-elect Trump has advocated, that's going to be a substantial hit to the U.S. consumer in advance of any certainty about tax policy that will come at the end of the year. The immigration component also will happen immediately. You're seeing that in both Canada and Mexico now, as those two nations try to accommodate Trump before he comes into office, uses the IEPA authority to impose tariffs and limits immigration that way. So you're going to see the hit to immigration and the tariffs much earlier than you're going to see any certainty around the straight line extension of the existing tax rates. And I think it's important to note that we're not talking about additional tax cuts to offset maybe the negatives of these tariffs. You're talking about a $4.6 trillion cost of just keeping tax cuts at their current rate, tax rates at their current rate.
All right, this is what we're doing, Alex. We're sending Henrietta to Washington to just fix things, just get stuff done. That's how good she is. Henrietta Trez, Managing Partner and Director of Economic Policy at Veda Partners. I'd send her to Washington tomorrow to get stuff done. She knows what she's talking about there. So we'll have to see how this plays out. But there's always a lot of moving pieces here. As you have a change of power, an exchange of power from one administration to the next, and we will keep in touch with Henrietta Trez. Looking at the markets, really not much happening here. S&P 500 off 6 points. The Dow Jones Industrials unchanged, and the Nasdaq's up 44 points. So not a lot happening there. Coming up, we're going to check in Munis. Boom, it is Friday. That means we talk munis. Eric Kazatsky, Bloomberg Intelligence, senior macro strategist, covering all that municipal bond stuff. That's coming up. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash, brought to you by Commonwealth. Join over 2,000 independent financial advisors who are taking control of their growth with advisor-centric support and future-ready technologies. Grow on your own terms with a partner dedicated to your success. Go to commonwealth.com to learn how. The major stock averages lower to little change right now. The tech-heavy NASDAQ, that has pared back its earlier gains. And Broadcom remains the best-performing stock in the NASDAQ 100, as well as the S&P 500, up right now 19, well, close to, we'll call it 20% right now. That's actually off its high of the session. The company predicting 65% growth in AI product sales in the fiscal first quarter. They also expect the addressable market for AI components to reach $90 billion by fiscal 2027. Looking ahead to next week, economists surveyed by Bloomberg say Federal Reserve officials are going to lower interest rates for a third straight time and also pare back the number of rate cuts that they anticipate next year. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
Now on Bloomberg Intelligence, Munis in Focus.
All right, folks, the focus on munis this week is brought to you by Build America Mutual. BAM Mutual insures municipal bonds that finance essential infrastructure and provides guaranteed income to improve any portfolio. Learn more about municipal bond credit quality. Visit BAMBonds.com. And there you go. Eric Kazatsky joins us. He's a senior municipal strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. He can hold his head high here, folks. The municipal bond total return index up 2.14%. This year. If you're in the high yield part of the municipal bond market, up 7.67%. So some green on the screen for the municipal bond market. Eric, just put us a little bit in the rearview mirror. What was the theme of 2024, and what are you looking for 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think the theme overall was one of surprise, right? Issuance really sort of blew all estimates away to the upside, right? We're about 30 to 40% higher year over year. And I think it caught a lot of people by surprise, just given the rate environment is. Do we think that's going to continue into next year? Maybe not, but certainly there are some things sort of brewing in the background, namely sort of some threats to the tax exemption potentially that could lead a lot of people sort of rushing to the market to get some sales in ahead of what could come with a new administration.
So I guess for new issuance, what's the outlook for new issuance here? I think I've got my Federal Reserve cutting rates, maybe not as much as I initially thought 6 months ago, but what are you hearing from issuers these days?
So we don't typically do a supply estimate for the year ahead, right? We sort of look at what cash is coming back to investors, and we can say safely that the market could probably absorb about $480 billion of issuance coming to the market, pretty comfortably. We've seen supply estimates come in from the street, though, that are really vastly disparate, right? On one end, you have an estimate, almost ranging near, $600, $700 billion under the guise that the tax exemption could definitely sort of be picked apart or eliminated, something like that, to a more moderate estimate of about 450 to 500 billion. So at the low end, you're really looking at a year that could probably be better than this year from an issuance standpoint and could really exceed expectations in sort of a nightmare scenario for our market.
And what about from a performance perspective, like high yield munis versus investment grade munis? What's the performance been this year? What's your expectation for next year?
Yeah, I mean, as Paul said, high yield munis are killing it this year. I mean, outperforming IG by about 500 basis points, and really not surprising, just given how tight spreads are with investment grade municipals. A recent deal that just priced for, some infrastructure related to a private ski resort, definitely in sort of the unrated market for munis. It priced pretty tight to where the, high yield muni index spreads are, right? So it shows that there's an overt demand for yieldy paper. We don't see that going away anytime soon. The one concern is that really, though, the market can kind of get over their skis, no pun intended, if spreads continue to sort of tighten in the high yield sector. And we're sort of, probably within 30 basis points, 40 basis points of that sort of warning bell going off.
Yeah, Paul, did you see this? I sent this over for you.
Yes.
Deer Valley
Yes, you
Resort
did.
in Utah is expanding to
Yeah.
become one of the largest ski resorts in North America with an additional 3,700 acres, 16 new lifts, 10 passenger gondola. A special district is borrowing $300 million in the high-yield muni debt to fund that development that'll have retail, luxury hotels, and
Where is this?
condos.
Yeah.
Deer
It is
Valley.
in Deer Valley,
Utah.
Utah.
Now, here's my take. Having skied Deer Valley many times and Park City many times, the charm, the attraction of Deer Valley is its charm. It is not Park City. It is smaller, more charming, higher value touch. You don't have to carry your skis to lift. They have valets that do that
So is
for
this
you.
going to ruin it for you?
That's my question. That would be my number one question. Guys, what are you
Yes,
thinking?
a valet.
What are you thinking?
That's so
To be
funny.
fair, those things are annoying and heavy, but go ahead anyway. Yeah, what do you think, Eric?
I mean, look, obviously Paul's an avid skier. I am not. I ski on the ice out here in the Northeast. I don't get out west too much. But, you know, I think the fact of the matter is the muni market is still financing these deals that are not typical muni deals, right? It's not for typical transportation. It's not for a new elementary school and not for a new high school. So interesting things are happening in our market. And I think you're going to see more of those type of deals because the demand is certainly there next year.
Eric, talk to us about the funds flows into municipal bonds in 2024, and what's the expectation for next year?
It's been pretty decent, but there's been sort of a fractured sort of diversification in our market that's going on. So more money we're seeing sort of go away from traditional mutual funds into SMAs and exchange traded funds. We actually ran the numbers on new product creation when it comes to ETFs, and there was a record amount created for the muni space this year, 27 versus 13 last year versus 6 2 years ago. So really you're seeing an increased trend of these sort of more liquid, lower fee type products that are sort of more appealing to a wider breadth of investors. You know, folks are even taking some of the old mutual funds and wrapping them in an ETF wrapper and repackaging them, trying to sort of play the hotter hand here.
Okay, so this is my really sophisticated muni question that I get when I don't understand munis anymore. What other cool things are you looking at in the space?
Oh my God. I mean, the biggest thing that people are talking about right now in my space is really what's going to happen with the tax exemption. And like I said, there's a lot of worry because the tax regime is certainly going to be in for a lot of changes if you're listening to a lot of the noise coming out of Florida and Washington right now. But I think, the thing for our space is that it serves a societal good. We're on the side of the camp that we don't think the exemption is going anywhere anytime soon. And if you look at where rates are right now, they're up about 14 basis points just this month alone. It's a really good time to be in the market getting exempt income.
All right, Eric Kozaski, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Eric Kozaski, he's a senior municipal strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence, broadcasting live from Princeton, New Jersey, down there at our Bloomberg Intelligence campus down there. Good stuff. Look at this. Elon Musk posting a letter on X stating that the SEC is investigating his company, Neuralink, and preparing to take action against him related to his Twitter account. So there's some issues between some of these regulators out there, the Securities and Exchange Commission and Elon Musk. Let's get the latest reporting. Lydia Bayud joins us. She's the SEC and CFTC reporter. Yes, we have a reporter that focuses just on the regulatory bodies. She's at Bloomberg News from Washington, D.C. Lydia, what's going on between Elon Musk and the SEC these days?
What isn't going on between Elon Musk and the SEC these days? So obviously the latest is sort of this airing of the reopened investigation into Neuralink, one of Elon Musk's companies. It also mentions that they're still looking at his takeover of Twitter in the subject line of the letter. So obviously still a lot of scrutiny by the SEC of Elon Musk as we head into this new administration where the SEC itself is going to be under scrutiny from Mr. Musk.
Exactly. That's so weird and tricky and confusing. So how does that relationship going to play out when you have Gary Gensler not going to be part of the SEC, a new administration coming in that Musk himself is involved in? How does that work?
A lot of that is TBD. We don't know exactly how the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is going to approach its work, but you can all but assume that the SEC itself is going to get particular scrutiny because of its history of investigating Elon Musk. That said, Vivek Ramaswamy yesterday put out a post on X saying that some of these federal agencies are duplicative, like the SEC and CFTC. We should think about restructuring them, and Elon Musk chimed in underneath, agreeing. So I think that type of idea, which has floated around Washington for a long time but has never come to fruition, is back on the table. So we could be looking at some radical restructuring. Whether or not any of that can get through Congress, which it would have to, we don't know, but it seems like it's an idea that's going to be taken seriously by this incoming administration.
So, Lydia, what are your sources within the CFTC, the SEC? What are they saying about maybe their exposure here to some restructuring risk here from, an Elon Musk and the Doge?
For now, I think that they're going to be operating under business as usual. Trump's already named an incoming chair for the SEC, Paul Atkins, who's been around Washington for many, many years as a former SEC commissioner, is very well regarded within Republican circles and kind of a serious policymaker, but also very keen on small government, reducing the size of government. So people know that changes are coming, but what the exact contours of those look like, we don't know yet. CFTC, we're expecting an announcement for a new chair very soon, perhaps someone along similar lines. We reported earlier this week that Brian Quintenz, a former Republican CFTC commissioner under the first Trump administration, seems to be one of the leading contenders for that. So if that's true, it's probably going to be a situation where, unlike in this administration where sometimes the SEC and CFTC were a little bit at loggerheads over some issues like crypto, we might see a lot more cooperation perhaps in this second Trump administration.
What is the space / company / sector that will be most impacted by these changes? Like, will it be crypto? Is it hard to say? Like, which area has the most question marks right now?
The SEC is such a large regulator of so many financial services companies that any structural changes to that agency in particular, whether it's staff, whether it's scope of work, certainly, half of the staff at the SEC is enforcement. So we're anticipating a pullback in enforcement actions, especially for crypto, but just generally. All these WhatsApp fines that we've seen during the Biden administration against companies that they said, you didn't keep records of these communications you were doing on WhatsApp or your text messages, whatever, with your clients or among your brokers, your staff. We think that that's really going to be curtailed. So I would say the impact is potentially kind of across the board. It's hard to single out one unless it is crypto, just because crypto obviously has been a major focus of this administration for enforcement and allegations of noncompliance with securities laws.
All right, Lydia, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Lydia Bayod, she is SEC and CFTC reporter for Bloomberg News, joining us from Washington, D.C. I wonder what the feeling is in some of these federal agencies, organizations down in Washington about their level of trepidation about what the incoming Trump administration and this efficiency effort by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, what it means for them, coming up.
Absolutely no idea. Right. Because it could have such significant changes. I don't know how you look at that, but also changes that could happen, but then in 4 years, do the changes go back? In which case, as a CEO, for example, how do you need to structure your choices on that? It's going to be really interesting to see.
And I need to get a little bit smart about what role Congress would play in any type of those changes here. What kind of approval would they need to get? So we'll keep an eye on that.
We'll get you an Excel spreadsheet.
Yes, thank you.
How about that? Someone make that for Paul.
Yeah.
All right, coming up, we're going to talk more about Broadcom soaring the most since 2020. Valuation tops $1 trillion. Kujan Sobhani, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Semi-Analyst, will be joining us on the latest results.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. After reaching a new all-time high, the NASDAQ 100 pairing the earlier gains. Broadcom, still the number one stock story of the day, surging right now. That is up close to 19% after the semiconductor company beat Wall Street profit targets. They also delivered a pretty glowing forecast, highlighting its artificial intelligence products. The company also raising its dividend. Meantime, Joe Quinlan at Bank of America sees the tech-led rally we've seen recently broadening out still.
When you're talking about artificial intelligence, the robotics revolution, more automation, productivity-led growth, I think technology does lead the way, but the good news is we still expect a broader breadth for the market over the course of 2025. So tech won't be the only story, just a big part of the story.
Right now, the NASDAQ 100, which was on track for another record close, is up just 0.3%, up 69 points right now, well off its session highs. The S&P 500 down 5 points right now. That's down about 0.1%, 60.45 on the index. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average up just 11 points at 43,924. And of course, next week, widely expected interest rate cut. The Federal Reserve more or less priced to deliver a quarter-point reduction. That might give another lift to stocks. Did you see this story? You know, you were talking about skiing earlier. Mm-hmm. Fast-moving storm is going to sweep into Northern California and the Pacific Northwest this weekend, bringing with it heavy snow. Upwards of 70 inches of snow could fall on California's high mountain ranges.
Squaw Valley, which they had to rename, political correctness, to Palisades.
Oh, I had no idea.
Yes, so
squaw and the back bowls there are
awesome.
Beyond belief.
That's almost 6 feet. That's,
Yeah,
it's like taller than me.
So you're gonna have to groom that at some point.
They have some of the snow they get out there is just extraordinary, particularly when you get these winter storms coming in, and they don't happen every year. But when they come in, and it sounds like this year is going to be a year, they get snow like you don't get anywhere else in terms of just amount. Now it tends to be heavier snow, Sierra cement. But still, it's good stuff, man.
From what we call the Pineapple Express coming from Hawaii, those big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we want the light, fluffy, the champagne.
By the time it gets to Utah and Colorado, the moisture's come out of it a little bit.
It dries out. That's the kind of snow you can sweep off your porch with just a broom. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of snow you want, Alex.
Alex is like,
I really didn't know that I was going to be in the middle of a weather podcast, but that's cool.
No, it was a scheme.
Next, if we talk golf, it'll be it'll really sync up for me. I'm going to go back to the stock market and look at shares of Broadcom up a whopping 19%. I want to get more with Kujan Sobhani, Bloomberg Intelligence senior semi-analyst. So we know the story. The numbers for its AI revenue were super high. Their outlook looked really good. Is it justified in a $1 trillion valuation right now?
I mean, look, going into the earnings, the top concerns were how is AI going to do next quarter? What are the numbers looking like for 2025? And sort of no visibility beyond that. So can this rally sustain? Those numbers that are driving the stock really gives investors 3 to 4 years quantifiable target and milestone to look at, and now just track the execution. And those numbers are pretty huge. I mean, you're talking about 3 to 4x fold growth in just the SAM, just from its 3 customers, not even including the additional 2 that they're working on.
So, Kujan, help us think about Broadcom now in comparison to NVIDIA and maybe even some of the other players. How's this industry as it relates to AI? How is it shaking out here?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Broadcom just barely 6 months or a year ago, people didn't even think of it as an AI company, right? It was primarily investor base. It was really loved for its free cash flow generating ability, highly profitable, sustainable, slow, mid to high, high single-digit grower. Now suddenly AI is going to become a huge chunk of its semiconductor revenues, and in combination, you still have the software revenues at high margin generating significant amount of cash. So you have this really fast-growing NVIDIA type or even growing faster in certain areas going forward than NVIDIA AI story, along with all the goodness of what you want from a large cap, which is high profitability, high operating margin, high free cash flow.
For the non-AI stuff, like the chips that go into like phones and cars and all that kind of stuff, how is that part of the business doing? Because it hasn't been doing very well. We've been waiting for their cyclical recovery to kind of kick up. Where did Broadcom land on this?
Yeah, I mean, that they are aligned very well to what rest of the cyclical semis are doing. I mean, look, 24 was the bottom for most of its business. We do expect recovery starting early next year, but it's going to be really slow turning corner. So we don't expect any sort of fireworks there. But the good news is the way AI is expected to grow, that portion of the business is going to shrink and become a significantly smaller part of their chip business.
All right, so as you step back from the semi-space these days, Kunjan, what are the conversations you're having about the space in general? Is it NVIDIA all the time? Do I want to own a basket of these things? What are some of the conversations you're having with your investor clients?
Yeah, the top question is sort of searching for the next NVIDIA, trying to add more and more AI exposed names, and who else in the semi sector and the peripheral sectors, whether it's foundries, whether it's memory, whether it's semiconductor equipment providers, can benefit from this broadening AI boom. You know, the first beneficiary, almost entire beneficiary, was just one name, NVIDIA. So that's a conversion we have, and we have been actually calling out Broadcom and Marvell for quite a while now that these are going to be sort of the next set of beneficiaries from the coverage that we cover.
When we take a look at Broadcom, though, and the stock reaction in the near term, are we borrowing faith from like 2025 or 2026, or is this like legit comp number rally?
I mean, there is definitely a huge weightage given on their ability to execute to that large SAM that they have laid out. You know, investors who have been following Hawk for many years don't take what he says lightly. There's a big, degree of conviction in what Hawk says and can deliver. So there is definitely a huge reliance in what you see in the stock movement that they will be able to sort of meet or execute on those numbers.
Right.
So when we see like a big number coming out of the likes of Broadcom, does that give you pause for the NVIDIA story that maybe there's a market share shift going along, that maybe the competition is starting to step up here?
Not in the near term. Look, the merchant silicon GPU that NVIDIA sells versus the custom that Broadcom does right now are being used for two different use cases. And both of those use cases, the demand is booming, right? So it's a win-win for everyone right now. Eventually, in theory, if this demand rally does normalize and there is some kind of digestion, look, there's only so much these hyperscalers will spend, right? So eventually down the road, we will come to a point where they will have to decide, do they want to spend more in their custom and the GPU, and what are people demanding for? At that point, there will be wallet share competitiveness, but not at this given point, just because the use cases and applications are very different.
They get the majority of their revenue really from Apple and WT Microelectronics, right? Then it comes sort of Alphabet and Meta with about 6 to 8% of its revenue. Thank you so much. Supply chain analysis function on the terminal. Are they trying to diversify that in a meaningful way, or are they comfortable with that sort of weighting?
I think it's just organically going to get diversified, right?
Okay.
The wireless from Apple is not a fast-growing business. It's sort of mid-single digit at best, right? So, and there are some concerns around that. It's too mature to talk about it. But even if you assume that business continues, and like the speed at which the AI business is going to increase, the speed at which Google, Meta, and these other hyperscalers are going to become a larger portion of Broadcom, it is organically going to diversify away from the top two customers that you pointed out.
All right, Kunjan, thanks so much for joining us. Kunjan Sobhani, senior analyst on semiconductors. He's over there at Bloomberg Intelligence, based in our San Francisco office right there in Silicon Valley, close to all those big tech companies that he covers. So that's a real advantage for us. Kunjan Sobhani joining us there. That's a heck of a move for a company, you know, a $1 trillion market cap stock to move 20%. I've said it when I was seeing some of the moves from NVIDIA when they were moving 10, 20, 30% in a day. This is huge amounts of shareholder wealth being created in this space. The absolute dollars are kind of stunning to take a look at it. So this isn't any penny stock out there. So
no. And I definitely recommend the supply chain analysis function. If you have a terminal, you can type in the ticker and then supply chain analysis, and you get a really good read on their suppliers, customers, and competitors, and just sort of how big this opportunity set can be. All right, coming up, Tim Craighead is back. 50 companies to watch in 2025. We're going to round it out for you. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We are streaming live on YouTube as well, so head over to youtube.com. That would be the internet, and search Bloomberg Podcast. That's where you'll find us. Analysts at Bloomberg Intelligence, who track about 2,000 companies in industries ranging from apparel and autos to finance and food, have identified 50 companies worth watching carefully in the year ahead, and we're bringing them to you this week. Tim Craighead joins us, Global Chief Content Officer for Bloomberg Intelligence. He's based over there in London. I don't think he's ever coming back to Southwest Virginia. Sorry, folks. He's over there, I think, forever. Hey, Tim, a lot of great names in here, a lot of great themes that you guys have held out. I think one of the stocks today that's getting investors' attention is Broadcom, and they're calling out their AI exposure. How do you guys at Bloomberg Intelligence think about AI? What companies are you highlighting for Bloomberg clients as it relates to AI?
Great being back, Paul. AI has 5 names on our list of 50. So, you think about it, it's 10% of the list. That's a pretty big deal. And it's also interesting in that it's a different set of names than what we had last year, where we also had a good bit of exposure. That was bigger sort of core AI names that you think about with large language models and whatnot, and some software companies. This year, it's much more about some of the enabling technologies, and primarily in the world of semiconductors, and that's exactly where Broadcom sits. I heard you talk to Kunjan a few minutes ago, and spot on.
Great call.
They have no doubt. A really interesting combination of semi and software in that company that is providing enabling chips. But Cadence Design is the software company behind the design of semiconductors. KLA makes test and measurement tools that you can't do this high-end semiconductor stuff without. Micron is making high bandwidth memory chips, which again, you have to make AI work. And then there's the odd one out is a company called VAT Group. They make vacuums, and it's like super high-end vacuums that create the vacuum in which you make semiconductors. So lots of interesting different kinds of plays.
I did not know that either.
Yeah.
What about the innovation part? So I appreciate that AI dovetails with innovation, but aside from AI, what are some companies that can really fit that bucket?
Well, I tell you, there are some really interesting ones there. We can't talk about innovation without talking about something in biopharma. Last year we had Lilly and we had Novo Nordisk. This year we've put AstraZeneca forward. They've got a host of new data sets coming out in cancer and in respiratory disease. You can tell I've been here in London so long. I say respiratory as opposed to respiratory. So
okay,
anyway,
we'll make fun of you.
Yeah, exactly. There's another healthcare one. Insulin. They have what's becoming the standard of care in wearable insulin patches, the Omnipod 5. And, that's a pretty cool story that's growing gangbusters. You got a couple of car companies, and it's because of new products. Call it innovation, because it is. Tesla is going to launch their low price car at some point in the first half of the year that we think makes sense. And Porsche has 5 cars that are in process. A couple have been announced, a couple are coming, but importantly, they're hybrid 911. And, those are going to, pardon the pun, drive really important revenue growth.
And folks, just
one last thing I would throw out to you guys. We were talking about the business yesterday, the banking business, and now the other. IMAX. We all like movies. This is the theater that you're going to go and actually see a real movie at, because you've got the monster screens. And there's more American theaters installing them, but they're also going abroad. And talking about dating ourselves in yesterday's conversation, I actually worked on that back at Goldman in '94, I think, when we took them public. So, it's been around a while, but it's an accelerating story.
Lots of good stuff there. And when Tim talks about Porsche, he knows what he's talking about. Back in the day when he lived in the United States and worked in our Princeton office, he would drive his kind of sporty little...
He'd drive his Porsche to the IMAX.
Yeah, and it was a very odd color blue, but it was very distinctive. And he'd park it way down at the end of the big parking lot, so nobody would bang into it. So now he's over in London. Now he rides his bike to work every day. I mean, who does that in London when it's like raining all the time? Tim Craighead, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Tim Craighead really helping us out there. He runs all the content for Bloomberg Intelligence globally. And, at Bloomberg Intelligence, I mean, some of this great research. Again, Broadcom, up 20% today. This is a stock that Bloomberg Intelligence highlighted in this report when it was released about 10 days ago. Would have made you a lot of money there. And so what we did at Bloomberg Intelligence, we went out, we were able to hire some of the best analysts on global Wall Street around the world. We then provided them with the best data for all of their industries and allow them to kind of use that data to formulate some good investment research for our clients. And that's kind of what the good folks at BR are doing. We try to highlight some of those between 10 and 12 p.m. every day here on Bloomberg Radio.
It was interesting to hear Tim talk about AstraZeneca, because speaking of weight loss drugs, Novo Nordisk's shot Ozempic apparently was linked to an increased risk of a rare form of vision loss. That's in a study that backs up Harvard University research published earlier this year. Diabetes patients who use Ozempic were more than twice as likely to be diagnosed with that rare condition, but the study wasn't able to determine whether there was an impact among those taking Wegovy for obesity as well. So that space is just fascinating and super fast moving at this point as well. That wraps it up for me and Paul. Have a lovely weekend. We will see you back here on Monday. Coming up, you got Balance of Power with Joe Matthew after this global news update on a day we're trading a little bit heavy now in the equity markets. This is Bloomberg.
This is CBS News on the Hour, sponsored by Progressive Insurance.
I'm Steve Kathan. 84-year-old California Democrat Nancy Pelosi is in a hospital overseas. CBS's Stacey Lynn has that developing story.
The former House Speaker suffered an injury on a trip to Luxembourg and has been admitted to a hospital for evaluation. In a statement, her spokesperson said she's currently receiving excellent treatment from doctors and medical professionals.
Pelosi is there with a delegation to mark World War II's Battle of the Bulge. Russia today unleashed what's being called one of the largest air assaults on Ukraine since the invasion began. CBS's Chris Livesay.
The International Atomic Energy Agency says that 5 of Ukraine's 9 nuclear power plants reduced electricity generation due to renewed attacks on energy infrastructure facilities. These strikes are part of Russia's ongoing strategy to cripple Ukraine's energy sector, especially during the cold, freezing winter months.
In Turkey, Secretary of State Blinken is making the case for a non-sectarian interim government in Syria.
There's broad agreement on what we would each like to see going forward, starting with the interim government in Syria, one that is inclusive and non-sectarian, one that protects the rights of minorities and women.
Today, Syrians celebrated the fall of the Assad regime after Friday prayers. Here at home, there's a stepped-up call for action after a string of mysterious drone sightings in parts of 3 states over several days.
We're calling upon not just the New York City Police Department, but others to get involved, get aggressive, figure out what these things are, and help at least alleviate some of the frustration, anxiety that many people share.
Vito Fossella is the Staten Island borough president in New York. The consulting firm McKinsey has agreed to pay $650 million to settle charges that it collaborated with Purdue Pharma to misbrand opioids. A new Harvard study finds obesity rates in the U.S. fell slightly in 2023 for the first time in a decade. Study author Benjamin Rader says it's partly due to the use of drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy.
We looked at something like 48 million measurements of BMI across a little over 10 years in the U.S. and found that in 2002, we basically experienced a plateau, and then in 2023, we actually experienced a fall where obesity declined.
On a podcast, the woman who accused 3 Duke University lacrosse players of rape nearly 20 years ago admits she made up the story. Crystal Mangum's story fell apart at the time, and the 3 players were cleared. Wall Street, right now the Dow is down 32 points. The S&P is down 6. This is CBS News.
world of politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Government funding runs out a week from today. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as congressional leaders inch closer to a deal that could emerge, we're told, as soon as this weekend. We're going to talk about that and a lot more this Friday the 13th with our friend Terry Haynes at Pangea Policy. Big tech is warming up to Donald Trump. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard and Bloomberg Business Week columnist Max Chafkin will join us with a special panel on the billionaires helping to fund Donald Trump's inaugural. And we're going to take a look at new analysis of Donald Trump's tax plans just out with help from our signature panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Gidi Shanzano, back together for this Friday. You made it to the threshold of the weekend. We start, as always, on Wall Street. Denise Pellegrini has the latest on the markets for us live from New York. Denise?
All right, thank you, Joe. And we check the markets for you, of course, all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks are lower, but some tech shares are hot, hot, hot. And this Bloomberg Business Flash is brought to you by American Arbitration Association. Business disputes are inevitable. Resolve faster with the American Arbitration Association, the global leader in alternative dispute resolution for over 90 years. More at adr.org. So why are stocks lower? One reason could be this. Bill Dudley, Bloomberg opinion columnist and former president of the New York Fed, says the Fed is already assuming the Trump tax cuts from his first administration will be extended. But there are some other huge uncertainties for the Federal Reserve right now.
The real problem on tariffs is you don't know how big they are, how long they're going to last, whether there's going to be retaliation. And on deportations, you just don't know the magnitude or speed of what the program is going to be. And so if you don't know what it's going to be, it's really hard to put it into the forecast as in terms of its likely effects. So I think the tax cut assumption is going to be in there, but nothing else.
Bill Dudley, former president of the New York Fed there. The Fed wraps up its next FOMC meeting next Wednesday. Dow right now is down 62 points, S&P 500 down 7, NASDAQ down 32. The yield on the 10-year right now, 4.38%. Spot gold right now down about 0.7%, $26.60 an ounce. And West Texas crude, it is higher right now, 71.15 a barrel. Shares of Broadcom bucking the downward trend. They're surging the most in years, up 19% right now, Joe. That is after predicting a boom in demand for its artificial intelligence chips. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Denise Pellegrini, and that, Joe, is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Denise, thank you so much. Great to have you along today. The Friday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, and on YouTube. You know the drill. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. We'll meet you here in the studio as soon as you log in. With a lot to talk about here, guess it could be a newsy weekend on this Friday the 13th. We hope for a lucky deal here to emerge this weekend. House and Senate leaders, they say they're coming close to a stopgap that'll bring us into either February or March. Sarah Chamberlain last evening, interesting, saying this is looking a little more like February. The question is what we will get for disaster relief funding, and that appears to be the reason why we don't have a deal yet. Could be beginning of next week. They'll kick the can, and then we'll have a big fight early next year. But I have a lot of things, including this, that I want to talk about with Terry Haynes. We're at a very important inflection moment right now. And the latest note from Terry, he's a poet, you know, this is why we like to have him on, refers to the bonfire of the regulatory vanities that's taking place here as part of the transition that we talk about every day. He is the founder of Pangea Policy. Terry Haynes, good Friday. It's good to see you. This is lucky, right? 13's lucky for you?
I don't know. You know, I'm personally agnostic on it in my life anyway. But, you know, one size fits all, right? Hopefully. So,
yeah,
hopefully good.
Yeah, I will. I feel like it's been a good day so far. There was no traffic. I got out of bed, realized it was Friday the 13th, and that the government was set to shut down a week from now. Are we going to sleepwalk into a shutdown, Terry, or are they going to get this done the next couple of days?
Yeah, I think they get this done. You know, as you pointed out at the top, they're pushing around on disaster funding, likely a couple of other things. But, you know, the bottom line is it's in no one's political interest to have a shutdown over Christmas. And so they're very, very likely not to do it. So I think at least we won't have to talk about that much longer.
Well, there's a neutering that's about to take place. As I read in your note to clients, the immediate bonfire of the regulatory vanities, you say, to make regulators neutering on January 20th, an immediate markets positive economic boost. This is largely why Wall Street has been so excited about Donald Trump, because we can debate, and they've got new numbers out here from Maya McGinnis's group showing that the tax cuts might actually mean very little economic growth in the end. But the idea of cutting all this red tape and eliminating some agencies, Terry, is what has the market in a lather here, right?
Yeah, a lot of it, and I wrote that recently, and the Wall Street Journal chimed in on it about a day later, very similarly, if not as poetically. But the markets get way over their skis on deregulation. I always, and I always caution them to have some realistic expectations. How about that? The whole Doge thing is largely a mirage. Nothing against the people pushing it. As I've said to you on earlier programs, I think I'm in favor of half of what Musk and Ramaswamy want to do, and I don't even know what it is yet. I mean but that's how that's how constipated Washington is. So I'm am I for it? Sure. Generally speaking, but they don't have any authority to do it. The people that are going to do it, I think, in financial services and a variety of other places are they're focused on efficiencies, but they're focused their root on not wanting to have too much overlapping regulation, and that's a good thing.
Well, it's interesting when we talk about the idea of eliminating red tape and creating growth. Not lost on me, by the way, Terry, when Donald Trump was asked on the other network yesterday at the New York Stock Exchange whether people should start buying right now, he did not say yes. He said, I'm not going to say that. This market might tip lower because we have been witnessing quite a melt up here. But the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is out with a new number crunch here, and they find that extending the Trump tax cuts set to expire next year may not boost the economy as much as promised. You already indicated the markets may be over their skis a little bit here. What does that mean come the middle of 2025 if the market keeps rocking here in a new Trump administration?
Well, my advice really is twofold. One is that economists and others tend to look at this stuff in a very siloed sort of way, whereas if you're Trump or the Trump people or senior members of Congress for that matter, they're not going to look at it in a siloed sort of way. They're going to look at it as where do tax cuts fit in with the other pro-growth aspects of what we have planned, whether it be deregulation, whether the president wants to put some tariffs in, regardless of how that goes. And then you've got a variety of other overlays that are going to make that decision not instantaneous on January the 20th. The first one is what we do about the debt ceiling, the debt limit. That'll be important because that'll get done, but there'll be a lot of brinksmanship. But it'll give you an idea of what the appetite of the Congress is and what the administration is for additional debt and deficit. So, that'll be important. Then Trump has to put a budget together. And then most importantly for the tax cuts, what ends up having to happen is a decision that I think really gets made in the Senate about how much deficit they want to incur. The last time, when I was doing this in a prior life, I was working with a pretty prominent economist, and we were going to do a note right after the 2016 election, what to expect on tax cuts. And what I said to the economist is, okay, how much more deficit can we incur if we get the corporate rate down to 20%? And he came back and said, well, that's $1.5 trillion. Now that sounds like a lot, but $1.5 trillion over 10 years is back then was thought to be doable, and that's where it ended up. That was my prediction, and that's where it ended up. But there's a lot of different overlay this time, whether it be the appetite of the market for this stuff, what the tariffs are going to look like, what the needs of the Defense Department are like, because those budgets are going to get raised in response to geopolitics. All these things very different than 2017.
Yeah, we could see our first $1 trillion defense budget, I suspect, in the year ahead if we can actually get to regular order here. You talk about the House, the way Congress might get along with this whole Trump approach when it comes to economic issues. We have a new chair of the House Financial Services Committee. It's French Hill, who, of course, our viewers and listeners know quite well from, a long conversation that the congressman has been having with this network. It's been brought to my attention. I always learn something new about Terry Haynes. Every time you come on, Terry, you basically invented the Financial Services Committee. And I wonder, with your long view, and it's relatively recent history, what you think French Hill brings to that panel. You've got, kind of a Reagan-era Republican here who's going to be interfacing with a Trump White House.
The really important thing to know about Mr. Hill, I think, is that he's really the first one since my old boss, Congressman Mike Oxley, who really focused on immediate impact to and on markets. What ends up happening in Washington so much, as you well know, is that, regulators and Congress alike get kind of caught up in regulatory capture issues. Everybody dithers around about regulation and whatnot, and few people really start where the beginning should be, which is focusing on the economic impacts. And I think that's really what you get out of that's really fundamentally, I think, what you get out of Hill. It's been touted a lot that his private sector experience in a bank helped him get the chairmanship. I'm sure that's true, but where I think he's going to excel and really differentiate himself is he's really going to focus on market impacts as well as just the kind of the regulatory overkill. And that's important, and that's a big positive. And, and kudos to you and others on this network for having the foresight to see that, that he should be talked with quite a lot. And now you've got a window into his thought process that nobody else really has.
Does it tell us, realizing he's sensitive to markets, just in our final moment here, that Steve Scalise doesn't necessarily have the last word on everything in the U.S. House?
The steering committee is the steering committee is very, very important, and you have to balance regional aspirations, and you have to balance the aspirations for the committee. What I saw from the steering committee in picking Hill really is they want to return that committee, the Financial Services Committee, to real prominence, and so that's good news for the industry too.
Fascinating. Well, we thank Terry Haynes for the House Financial Services Committee. How about that? He also, of course, founded Pangea Policy, from where he talks to us right now. Terry, great to see you. Happy Friday. Have a great weekend. Another frequent voice here for a good reason on Bloomberg. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for being with us. An important panel coming up next as Big Tech warms up to Mar-a-Lago. It's right here on the fastest show in politics on Bloomberg.
it is 12:21 on Wall Street. I'm Denise Pellegrini. We check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. And this Bloomberg Business Flash is brought to you by IBKR. Financial advisors switch to Interactive Brokers for lowest cost global trading and turnkey custody solutions. No ticket charges and no conflicts of your interest at ibkr.com/RIA. Stocks are lower, but Broadcom is surging on strong prospects for more AI-related business. So let's talk about that good news first. It's up about 20% right now. Dan Ives, senior equity analyst over at Wedbush Securities, says software companies are really getting in on the AI party now, too.
If you look at Salesforce.com and you look what's happening in software, they were waiting in line to get into that AI party. While Jensen's on the dance floor, Ellison, of course, Cook. And now, behind those velvet ropes, they're like, Benioff, come on in. Now software is part of the AI part because of the use cases, and that's why it continues to be 10 p.m. in the AI party that goes to 4 a.m.
And the AI party continues, but we're not seeing it in the Dow. It is down session low, just about down 103 points now. S&P 500, it is down 10. NASDAQ down 41. Yield on the 10-year right now, 4.38%. Spot gold down about 0.8% at 26.59. And as for NYMEX crude, West Texas crude, it is up 1.6% right now, 71.11 a barrel. Also, as we've been talking about, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi hospitalized. That's after the 84-year-old was injured during a congressional trip to Luxembourg. A spokesperson for Pelosi says she does continue to work from the hospital. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Denise Pellegrini, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Joe.
All right, Denise, thank you so much. And thanks for being with us on the Friday edition of Balance of Power. You made it to the threshold of the weekend, and some fascinating stories to talk about here as we anticipate the arrival of Donald Trump on January 20th in Washington. You know, we've got the Army-Navy game this weekend. We'll be talking about that a lot at the beginning of next week. Ron DeSantis is going, right? Are we still sure why? Speaker Mike Johnson's going to be there, too, as he takes a little bit of advice from the president-elect on the sequencing of border versus tax cuts and the agenda for the new Congress. But I'll tell you what, high tech is not waiting around either. The list of names making pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago, meeting Donald Trump at events, investing in his inaugural, is really starting to add up. We learned just yesterday Jeff Bezos will be meeting with Donald Trump next week. I see here now Google CEO Sundar Pichai is scheduled for a sit-down on Thursday. Of course, you know, the big thing at the NYSE yesterday, the Person of the Year, Time magazine, owned by the CEO of Salesforce, Mark Benioff. You might not have known this, but there's a lot more where this came from. Enter Mark Zuckerberg, right? Donating $1 million. Sam Altman, another $1 million. You kind of have to give, I guess, $1 million. This is going to be a heck of an inaugural. So we thought we would have a conversation here with a couple of people right in the middle of this story. One of them you know pretty often from this program, Mike Shepard, who here in Washington covers the intersection of technology and politics. We're also joined by Max Chafkin, Bloomberg Business Week columnist. And gentlemen, it's great to see you both. Thanks for being here on this Friday. Mike, I'll start with you on the remarkable turn here. We talk about how many from the center and even from the left are kind of giving Donald Trump a chance, saying nice things, maybe propping up some of his cabinet picks, helping them get to hearings. Big tech is doing its own version of this, huh?
Well, it really is. And it is a turnabout from what we saw back in the first administration when tech really kept Trump largely at arm's length. One of the few CEOs who really had that kind of productive working relationship with Trump, when we think back, was Tim Cook. And he had a whole different set of stakes at hand. And remember, this is when Donald Trump was heating up a trade war with China. There was the risk of U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods and then retaliation by China against American products. And perhaps these days around the world, Apple is one of the most American branded products. So at the time, Tim Cook really wanted to make sure that there was some sort of protection for his company. He managed to secure it. This time around, the CEOs of these other companies, including Amazon.com and the founder, it's not just Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, but also Andy Jassy has also been making his own outreach as Amazon CEO to the incoming Trump team. And likewise, we saw Mark Zuckerberg having dinner last month with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. It is not only a rite of passage, but a necessary one. These companies are all facing some degree of antitrust scrutiny. There is regulatory overhang that they're worried about, and they're hoping that Trump, who's coming to office with this promise of relief for corporate America, that he might bring it for them too.
Yeah, Max Chafkin in New York. These are all big personalities with big pocketbooks we're talking about. Are they being motivated by fear or opportunity or both?
I think it's both. And, you look back, remember back to 2016, 2017, you did see efforts by folks like Bezos and even Zuckerberg to court Trump back then. They just were not as loud about it. And we didn't see these big monetary donations. And it just wasn't as prominent or out in the open, or maybe even, brazen if you're taking the point of view of a critic. That said, as Mike says, you have the potential of FTC investigations for both Amazon and Facebook. And in the case of Sam Altman, you have this looming threat of AI regulation. And not only that, but Elon Musk who's a competitor to Sam Altman in AI, is a key advisor to the president-elect.
What do you make of the money here? Mike, you covered politics before you entered the technology space for some time. Altman $1 million, Zuckerberg $1 million, Bezos $1 million. Tell our audience where this money's going.
Well, this is not unusual to see big companies making donations and contributions to the inaugural efforts, the inaugural committees. This is something we've seen over the years.
That might sound weird to people, though. This isn't a campaign they're donating to. Is this money for parties?
It is to the event. It's for the parties. It's to help the extravaganza that we're going to see in just a matter of weeks. If you think about it, in about a month from now, we're going to be really in the thick of it. And that helps to defray some of the costs and maybe add a little bit of the pomp and circumstance, too. And what's interesting on the tech side is just how much, and as Max was saying, how open they are about it and how much they have just hopped aboard this bandwagon of corporate support for an otherwise political event that other industries have more or less been hip to, but tech has always been a little bit more arm's length about it, not so much anymore.
You mentioned the potential, I don't know if I should call them conflicts of interest here, Max. I mean, Elon Musk has his own version, actually running a government contractor in SpaceX and some of his business dealings with the federal government. But when a lot of people see stories like this, and I thought we were going to drain the swamp. You're given $1 million for good treatment once the president-elect takes office, aren't you?
I mean, this tension, we saw this tension during the last Trump presidency, and it's going to be there this time. I think from the point of view of Trump and his supporters, the swamp is government workers, right? It's not, and government agencies. It's not necessarily billionaires who are trying to donate money in the hopes of influencing policy. That said, of course, the left, I mean, they are already talking about this. This is going to be a huge issue. And just to underline something that sort of came up earlier, it's not just that Mark Zuckerberg is threatened with an FTC inquiry. Trump was on the campaign trail saying he was going to throw Mark Zuckerberg in jail. And obviously that sounds like rhetoric, right, especially coming from someone like Trump, but it really does just show that these guys feel, under threat, under serious threat to their businesses. And then there's also the sense that Trump is more flexible, maybe more flexible than Biden or Harris would have been if she had been elected, in terms of being willing to sort of listen to the business world and make policy that they're going to be happy about.
Yeah. So, gosh, if this is stay out of jail money for Mark Zuckerberg, is it also take care of TikTok for me, Mark Zuckerberg?
Take care of TikTok and take care of other issues too.
Where's Trump on TikTok now? We've heard from both.
We don't really know what his opinion is as of like 5 minutes ago.
Right.
We do know from the campaign that he had actually reversed his position and says he no longer thinks that a ban of the app is justified.
But remember, his worry was that would help Zuckerberg. Now they're hanging out.
So now how does that change? And and it will be fascinating to see once we get a final outcome in court on TikTok where he falls and whether the whole Zuckerberg relationship question pivots him in a different direction.
Sure.
I wanted to touch on one point that Max was making earlier, and that is just about how they feel the need to perhaps avoid any possible retribution by Trump or his, the people he's designating for some of these big agencies, including the FBI. What's interesting also is how accessible, or much more accessible, Trump can be and can make himself to people in power in the business world. And so if you're a billionaire and you drop your card at the front door of Mar-a-Lago, it is not very long before they let you in. And he is really eager to make those relationships work and flourish doing. And as you said on TikTok, perhaps try to help them out if they can.
What do you make of the evolution on TikTok, Max? What will the Trump administration mean for this platform?
Well, Trump sort of switched his position on TikTok roughly around the same time that he got a big donation from Jeff Yass, who runs Susquehanna Capital, which has an investment in TikTok. That, it felt like he was at that time really trying to adopt kind of business-friendly positions. Of course, since then, there are all these other donors, maybe donors who don't care as much about whether TikTok is banned or not, or whether it gets sold to another company. I do think that Zuckerberg, part of his motivation here, part of it is the SEC, is the FTC. Part of it is the point that Mike is making about just sort of general accessibility, and part of it, is TikTok. That's the big competitor, Facebook. And if it is harmed in some way, or hampered, or banned, or what have you, that is going to be good news for Zuckerberg. The other point I'll make is, at the same time this is happening, Trump has appointed a head of antitrust at the DOJ, Gail Salter, who's expected to kind of continue these investigations, these cases that the DOJ has brought against Google and Apple. Now, those are both Facebook competitors. So right now, Zuckerberg is a lot of what he would have wanted from this presidency, and so it sort of makes sense that he's making a donation.
Can you imagine, in our last minute here, and I think you can, in the early stages of the Trump administration, a big event in the auditorium in the executive office building across the driveway from the White House with all of these characters around a round table with Donald Trump?
Very easily. It's the kind of event he liked to convene during his first term, and I would easily see that taking place.
They all want to be on good terms with each other, it sounds like.
It does. Even though they do compete with each other, there is some interest in, they want to have a common understanding.
Well, when it comes to politics.
And especially when it comes to politics, you're right.
Boy, that's going to be something. You can just imagine the optics now, Max. It's great to have you in New York. Don't be a stranger. It's good to have you with Bloomberg Business Week columnist Max Chafkin from World Headquarters in New York. And, of course, Shep with me here in Washington, Mike Shepard, covering the intersection of politics and technology. His actual title, by the way, I always say this, Senior Editor, Technology Industries. That sounds more important. Mike, thank you. And Max, thank you. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, and we've got a lot more to go here with our panel. Our signature panel is back together on the Friday edition. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano coming up next for their take on all the stories that we've been talking about here, whether we get a deal to avoid a shutdown a week from today, and what we should be paying attention to this weekend at the Army-Navy game. The transition not only happening in the halls of power, but also in the football stadium. Someone call Ron DeSantis. We've got a conversation next here on Bloomberg.
It is 12:40. I'm Denise Pellegrini. Stocks are lower, but some tech stocks are skyrocketing. We check the markets all day long for you here at Bloomberg. And this business flash is brought to you by JP Morgan Asset Management. Stay informed on today's fastest growing investment vehicle with the new guide to ETFs. Visit jpmorgan.com/ETF insights to learn more. As I mentioned, stocks are lower. And Rick Reeder, CIO of Global Fixed Income at BlackRock, says the outlook could appear rosy for stocks, but watch out because
at some point, the economy is going to moderate. I think we're a few months from that. But you can see a dynamic as you get to the back half of this year that you start to see some, particularly if you got tariffs, you would get some global slowdown.
And Reader there from BlackRock. The Dow right now down pretty much close to session low, down about 114 points. S&P 500, it is down 14. NASDAQ down 63. And the yield on the 10-year right now, 4.39%. Spot gold down about 0.8%, 26.58 an ounce. And West Texas crude, it is surging up 1.71%. That puts it at 71.21 a barrel. Got to talk about Broadcom surging more than 19% right now. And that's on all the rosy talk about AI and how that business could continue to grow. They do have some proof of that in their numbers. And more detail coming in now on the hospitalization of former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. We've been talking about she was injured during a congressional trip to Luxembourg, apparently sustaining that injury during an official engagement of the congressional delegation, which is marking the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge there. A spokesperson for Pelosi says she does continue to work from the hospital. So that's what we know so far. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Denise Pellegrini, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Joe.
All right, sounds good, Denise. Thanks for the update on Nancy Pelosi. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining us here on the Friday edition of Balance of Power. We're all going to be watching Army-Navy game tomorrow, right? 3 p.m. Washington time. And it's right down the road from here. They're doing this in Landover, right? This is at the commander's. Just imagine what it's going to be like in the presidential suite. We actually have some news on this today. I already told you about Ron DeSantis got the invite from Donald Trump. He's coming up here for the game. And when this was announced, it was presumably to discuss this idea of maybe being the next defense secretary, sounding a lot more like it's to discuss Lara Trump being the next senator from Florida. Daniel Penny will also be in the suite, invited by J.D. Vance, the man recently acquitted in the chokehold death of Jordan Neely. Interesting choices. Speaker Mike Johnson also will be there, right? They were going to talk at the game about, well, what exactly to do with the congressional agenda in the new Congress. They got a lot to do between the hot dogs and beer. So let's assemble our political panel, because we've got a lot to talk about, as always, with Rick and Jeannie. Glad to say they are back together here for our Friday edition. Jeannie Shanzano, Senior Democracy Fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Democratic analyst Rick Davis, Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital. Rick, you got your tickets to the game?
I'm going to stick it at home. I always like watching football from a TV screen.
You're smart, because I'll tell you what, the optics are going to be pretty wild tomorrow. Which of these guests are you paying attention to, and what is the conversation? What's the tenor going to be like inside the suite?
Yeah, I think this Johnson issue is a big one, right? That's going to have profound impact on the first year of the Trump presidency, and that is, do they try to package a massive tax cuts, border plan, all of the above kind of approach to legislation, or do more like what John Thune's talking about, which is a two-step process where you split off taxes and do them later, and get, the border and other critical needs done, right away. Frankly, things that are easier to do. That's a big difference. And I think that will inform the next year's debate in Congress and in the White House as to what are the accomplishments that the Trump administration can do.
Mm-hmm. Jeannie, I checked to see if Mitt Romney was invited. Because I'll tell you something, this Ron DeSantis situation feels a lot like Mitt Romney going out to dinner, Trump Tower with Donald Trump 4 years ago. We all remember the images. I think that's where maybe they were here in Washington. Either way, you remember he turned around, got caught there with Donald Trump knowing all the while he was not going to be tapping Mitt Romney for anything. Is Ron DeSantis stepping into a trap here that may or may not include joining the Trump administration?
Poor Ron. He's out. You said Bill. I thought you were going to say that Bill Belichick was going to be invited because, of course, he's very much in the news right now. That's the only thing I know about football today. But for poor Ron, I think it is, and Ron DeSantis has better get his ask ready in terms of what he would like, and I'm sure there are things. So I think that is going to be fascinating to watch. The other thing is that Pete Hegseth, was he still not invited? I know he's doing better this week, but the fact that Pete is still not invited, if he's not, I don't know what that says about it. But most importantly, I think Donald Trump is feeling really good. Second time he's Man of the Year for Time magazine. He's just going to be out there. I don't know. I don't think he doesn't drink beer, but he'll be out there enjoying himself and tailgating a bit.
Interesting to hear J. Vance's guest. He actually said something about this recently, writing on X. Daniel's a good guy, and New York's mob district attorney tried to ruin his life for having a backbone. I'm grateful he accepted my invitation and hope he is able to fun and appreciate how much his fellow citizens admire his courage. Is this good politics, Rick?
Yeah, I mean, J.D. Vance is going to be the philosopher, vice president, the ideologue within the Trump administration, really the keeper of the MAGA flame. And for a citizen to, try to do a little, vigilante justice on the subway in New York fits perfectly into the methodology of what he's trying to accomplish. So, yeah, this is a big symbolic gesture. Has actually very little to do with the act itself, but more the symbolism of individuals taking over control where the institutions of government have failed them.
How does it hit you, Jeannie? Some folks were offended by this pick. Obviously, there's politics, I guess, involved here. Some people say he's a hero. Other people say, he ended up killing a guy here, realizing it was unintentional, with some pretty difficult optics for people.
Yeah, I mean, just a horrible situation. It really divided people, obviously really divided this jury, and he was acquitted. I think the reality is we're seeing Alvin Bragg get it from both sides because, of course, you also saw John Fetterman join Truth Social and not just join, but call for the pardoning of Donald Trump from that Manhattan conviction. So you are seeing a lot of pushback. And I think, it's obviously John Fetterman, a Democrat, J.D. Vance, obviously, is going to be vice president, a Republican. I think people are sort of trying to wake up and grapple and wrap their head around what they saw in the election and what it means for them on the ground and where the American public stands. And I think one of the things you hear a lot in New York City about this case with Penny was the fact that, as horrific as the situation was, and obviously it is, also the reality that in New York City, there is a challenge with crime and with people who are mentally unstable, who are not getting the assistance and the help they need, putting people in a situation on the ground who feel like something's got to be done. And so I think this is what we're going to see J.D. Vance and others talking an awful lot about as we move forward.
Well, Penny was acquitted of all charges this week related to the killing of Neely, and we did hear from J.D. Vance again on X. I've not said much about this case out of fear of influencing the jury, he wrote. But thank God justice was done in this case. It was a scandal Penny was ever prosecuted in the first place. Rick Davis, I don't know if Elon Musk is going to show up, but we saw the ball go to a UFC match at Madison. This sort of approach to have event-driven optics like this, whether you're going to a football game or a fight, you bring in all the advisors, you're having meetings in the suite. Is this a new way of doing politics in the public eye?
Well, I certainly think it's a standard in the Trump world. I mean, even just going to ring the bell at the New York Stock Exchange brought almost the entire potential cabinet coming out with him. He likes to run with a posse. That's no question about it. And he gets a lot done in the process. I mean, he is talking to each of these individuals about potential future picks within his administration. He's airing out issues, thinking about what to do, vis-a-vis the legislative agenda. And that's the way he likes to operate. And there's no telling which one of them has an impact any given day. So it's in their interest to stick around because they know that's how he makes these decisions. So when he says, hey, I'm going to put a group together to go to a football game or, a steel cage match or ringing the bell at the stock market, you better show up because it could be your policy that gets dragged through the mud.
Right.
It's actually going to see how this all emerges because I do think this is a holdover from the campaign where he loved to travel with a posse.
You put it so well, Rick. I wonder if half of Silicon Valley shows up at the Army-Navy game. Jeannie, as we were discussing with Mike and Max a little earlier this hour, everybody is raising their hand to have a meeting and to deliver a donation to the inaugural committee. Mark Zuckerberg, $1 million. Jeff Bezos, $1 million. Sundar Pichai's got one on the calendar. Sam Altman, $1 million. Maybe we'll see high tech getting together with Donald Trump. I would just wonder what you make of this moment, Jeannie, when the leaders of these biggest companies in the world, sitting on the largest piles of cash in the corporate world, are acting, I guess, out of fear, Andy, to get closer to Donald Trump following years of contentious relationships.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating to watch. When we think about the idea that Donald Trump was going to, and then you look at what is happening with these donations and you start to think maybe the definition of the swamp excludes all of these CEOs who are coming, and can't blame them because they have to answer to boards, they have to answer to shareholders, and they have a lot on the line. We talk about Mark Zuckerberg, $1 million. Boy, when you look at what Donald Trump was promising yesterday in terms of tax cuts, the corporate tax rate down to 15%, that would save Meta almost $1.5 billion. So Mark Zuckerberg make a good deal there. If you got $1 million, put it in because you can potentially save $1.5 billion for your shareholders. So, this is what we're seeing. And, I have to say, we all know Rick Davis is a Swiftie and he's using the term posse. I think that Donald Trump is picking up on what Taylor Swift has done at all of these games as she goes out and supports her boyfriend. Donald Trump liked these games. It's like the Trumpies are getting together. So I think he's following suit. He was worried she might be person of the year, and he beat her on that. Wow. And now he's just picking up where she left off with her posse.
You guys are great. Rick, Max Chafkin said something really important, though. To Jeannie's point just now, Donald Trump doesn't look at this as the swamp. He looks at the bureaucracy as the swamp. They're two really different things. What do the Zuckerbergs, Pichais, and Bezoses get out of these meetings and these donations?
All I got to say is $400 billion. I mean, the guy who got to the trough first, Elon Musk, has just seen as part of the Trump trade in this election, his net worth going up from there because it's pretty clear he's going to have his way with the Defense Department, the largest pot of money in the American government, to swim in this administration. So, yeah, they look at that and they say, holy smokes, the election. How in the world do we get a part of that? And I think it's just economics. It's smart economics.
So bye. Hey, producer Matt brings up a good point, Rick, here in the Washington area for people listening on 99.1. The good thing about the lawmakers going to Landover's stadium, awful stadium, Matt calls it, is the new funds for fixing RFK Stadium might get green-lighted the next day. Rick, what do you think?
Yeah, I think spending the day in that the stadium, is going to turn a lot of heads. And I think they were headed there anyway. They'd much rather have it in their own backyard. It's easier to get there than driving up the Beltway. So, yeah, I think that's probably incentive enough.
Fair enough. Well, though, as Rick Davis, thank you. Jeannie Shanzano, our signature panel. They'll be back in hour 2 with a lot more to talk about here on Balance of Power. We'll welcome our global TV audience to the conversation. Kaylee Lyons will be along as well. We're going to take a closer look coming up at this new analysis into Donald Trump's tax plans. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget sees no growth. We'll have a lot more on that ahead. Stay with us right here on Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The Trump tax cuts may not bring the growth some expect. Welcome to the fastest show in politics with new analysis out today on the impact of extending the 2017 tax cuts. It may sound contrarian as we dig into the numbers here from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power. You made it to the threshold of the weekend. This is not a new concept here, Kaylee, but I guess a new wrinkle on this research.
Yeah, and we should point out the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is seen as a nonpartisan institution, though I wouldn't be surprised if there were some in the president-elect's orbit who would push back on this kind of
course they would.
Analysis, because the argument has always been for the tax cuts that he would like to see put into place once he takes office and we have an expiration we're dealing with in 2025. The suggestion is not only will you be able to offset some of that lost revenue with higher tariffs, but also we will grow our way out of this.
Exactly
the growth that these tax cuts will stimulate will help essentially pay for them. But the committee is essentially saying, not so fast. The growth effects will not be what has been suggested.
Could do almost nothing to grow the economy, which would suggest Wall Street is a bit ahead of itself in the melt-up here leading into the Trump administration.
Yeah, well, we certainly have seen that, and of course saw the president-elect at the New York Stock Exchange yesterday touting the economy, and again, what he would like to do with taxes. And he probably, as we saw in his first presidency, will be using the performance of equity markets as something of a benchmark as to how things are going.
Bit of a political poll that he tends to prefer. Although when asked yesterday, not lost on us, asked at the New York Stock Exchange if people should start buying stocks, he didn't say yes. He said he was afraid he would lead people into the markets and it might go down. So I don't know, maybe we're nearing a peak or something in his view.
Well, maybe Laura Davison has a bit more inside information into that one. She is a politics editor for us here at Bloomberg, joining us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Laura, if we could just reference back to the fact that we saw a Trump tax package before. It was in 2017. We know we didn't grow our way out of those, but his camp would argue a pandemic got in the way. This analysis, though, suggests that even without a pandemic, you won't grow your way out of this one.
Yeah, and the difference here between 2017 is there was some economic growth from the 2017 tax cuts. Most of that, economists say, is from all of the corporate stuff, the deductions for investing in equipment and the corporate tax cuts. That provided growth. That is all permanent. So that is all sort of status quo. What is expiring and what needs to be extended are all the things for individuals. So this is the child tax credit, individual tax rates, some tax deductions for small business owners. Those types of cuts, economists say, don't have that same kind of economic boost. They just don't have the same kind of feedback that shows up in the numbers. So you cut it. There are reasons that to do some of those cuts. Some people say, and Democrats and Republicans like to argue about that. But in terms of if you're going to say we should do this because it's going to grow the economy, the data just isn't there.
The message we've received from Scott Bessent, the incoming Treasury Secretary, yet to be confirmed, in our conversations before him being named, is you're missing the forest for the trees. That this is about an overall approach that includes lower energy prices, cutting red tape. Yes, the tax cuts combined with the tariffs. That is pretty difficult to quantify, though, isn't it?
This is still early days. What the Congressional Budget Office and the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which are the numbers here, they're sort of making some assumptions about what Republicans are going to do, but they're just looking at the extension of what happened in 2017. That's up for renewal. That's going to expire. What is it going to take to make that happen? Trump has yesterday at the stock exchange talked about lowering the corporate rate. That would incidentally perhaps upset Democrats, not be something that even some Republicans want, but it probably would provide more economic growth. So there's lots of dials and levers that congressional Republicans can turn as they're trying to put together this package. The big question, though, is they just don't have enough things that are revenue raising that would offset the cost. They have plenty of ideas on how to spend the money. It's just how do we pay for it that they're really still light on ideas.
That dang math. It's a problem.
It always is.
It's an equation that I guess is hard to solve here in Washington, but what else is new? As we consider that probably broadly, most of corporate America would be pretty thrilled with a lower tax rate, I wonder about technology companies in particular, because we are seeing a lot of activity for tech companies, but more specifically the billionaires who lead them when it comes to their relationship with this administration already. Meta donating $1 million to Trump's inaugural committee now reports that Amazon is doing the same. And Trump said yesterday Jeff Bezos is going to make a trip to Mar-a-Lago next week.
Yes, we are really seeing a total shift in how big tech is really embracing Trump this go round. And we've seen these pilgrimages down to Mar-a-Lago, for Meta and for Amazon rather. These donations to Trump are sort of very unique. These are very large numbers that we're seeing, and they've really pulled back. These are companies that back in 2016, even for the inauguration, which tends to be more of a bipartisan kind of effort. They did not donate. There were the kind of companies that we saw donating to Trump's 2017 inaugurals were, energy companies, some, really more kind of very conservative leaning. Now we're seeing everybody almost tripping over themselves to say, hey, look, Donald Trump, I'm giving, I'm here, I want to work with you, because there are these threats of tariffs as well as, the potential for gains, like on a corporate tax cut, that companies see, with a president they know to be very transactional, and this is just how you play the game.
Well, do they get a seat at the table? What do the Bezoses and Zuckerbergs get back from, I guess, this new relationship that they're forming? Does Mark Zuckerberg watch the elimination of TikTok as a result? What's the end game for them?
So literally, they do get a seat at the table by donating $1 million. That's the threshold to get sort of special access to all of the inaugural events, so they can send the CEO, top executives. But afterwards, it means that as he's putting together CEO councils, as he's been one to do, he's been talking about crypto councils, AI councils. Those are the names that are going to be at the top of the list of, hey, who should we appoint to these kinds of things? We saw in the first term, Apple went to the Trump administration and said, look, here's why you need to exempt us from your tariffs. And they got an exemption. So these companies are realizing if you start building this relationship now, when you've got a problem 2, 3, 4, 5 months down the line, you have those connections, the people. This is sort of how you play the game.
Yeah, I wonder how much of this is not just about the company, but specifically about the personalities at the top, like these individuals who are also fabulously wealthy, but not quite at the level of, say, Elon Musk, who everybody has watched very publicly get super close with Donald Trump. But if you're Bezos, who has a competing commercial space operation in Blue Origin, he's probably thinking, okay, well, if Musk got in, I got to get in too, to at least some degree, right?
Especially if your competitor now is the person in charge of, government efficiency and perhaps, slashing costs and contracts. You want to make sure that the things that are getting slashed are not the contracts that your company has.
Army-Navy game. Are these guys going to show up this weekend? Everyone else is. Ron DeSantis is there, right? Speaker Johnson's going to be there. We're going to see
President-elect
Mark Zuckerberg roll in there. I mean, I'm guessing Elon's going to be there, no?
Almost certainly there's going to be a whole box full of surprises there. We'll see if Pete Hegseth is there. Unclear whether he'll be there, but, and where that heads. He had a good week this week. He had, not full support from Joni Ernst, but he got a little bit of a hump there. We'll see if DeSantis is able to bend his ear during the game and where that drama heads as we head into Christmas week.
Well, I do wonder if the only thing Trump is really interested in talking to DeSantis about is that Senate seat that'll be vacated by Marco Rubio that his daughter-in-law seems to want to fill.
This is really, we now have, there's more reporting that's come out that this conversation is happening. Laura Trump stepped down from the RNC, just in the past several days. That seat has been filled. So she is now unemployed. I think she's doing okay. But, that she is clearly in the market for something. And, Trump likes to make these trades and make sure he's also getting something out of it.
Right. Yeah. Boy, look, I guess a lot of stuff could happen inside the presidential suite in Landover at the stadium, but are we really going to figure out the congressional agenda during the game? That this is the only venue for Donald Trump and Mike Johnson to talk?
Congressional Republicans are really waiting for a sign from Trump on what they should prioritize. They're going into next year. You have a big spat going on right now between the House and Senate. Of the House wants to move first on taxes. The Senate wants to move first on immigration. And really, what Johnson is going in there is, say, hey, look, we want to move on taxes. We're worried that if we get sidetracked by other things, that this tax bill is never going to happen. Whereas, Senator John Thune, the head Republican in the Senate, is saying, look, we want to make sure this immigration package happens. So this is, like we're seeing from the CEOs going in, establishing these relationships. Also, congressional leaders are making sure that their priorities are at the top of his mind.
Well, and the two Republican chamber leaders have different realities, right? The majority for John Thune is going to be much more comfortable than Mike Johnson's will be, at least initially, until all these special elections to fill the vacancies for those joining the administration will be held.
Yeah, and even then, so a 1-seat majority, that's just really tough, no matter what happens. But a 3-seat majority, when you're trying to do some of these big things, like a tax bill where there's all these different provisions. There's, you know, there's a lot for Republicans to like, but also several things that people are not going to like. You know, the state and local tax deduction, the SALT deduction, that's super polarizing. You have, you know, for majority of the Republicans, they don't care about it at all, but you have 6 or 7 or 8 who this is a really big deal and they could lose their seats over it.
Yeah.
You can only lose 3 people, but 8 really care about it. What do you do there?
So maybe around halftime, we'll find out if it's tax cuts or border.
Yeah.
This is going to be interesting.
I guess so.
After the nachos, before the wings.
Yeah.
Okay.
Monitor True Social, I guess, for game
We
updates
will.
and, you know, negotiating. Laura Davison, Bloomberg Politics
Thanks,
editor,
Laura.
thank you so much for joining us. Of course, the common denominator, though, that we're talking about here is how difficult the math is. The math is difficult from a majority standpoint when you're actually counting votes, but it's also difficult to work out fiscally, if you want to do so in a manner at least mildly responsible, how you can give this president-elect everything he wants when it comes to taxes while also not widening the deficit in an incredibly material way. And by that, we mean trillions and trillions of dollars. And we know these fiscal difficulties are not unique to Washington, although they feel particularly bad here. But all you got to do is look to Europe to see how hard budgeting is for everyone.
Well, I mean, go back a week and we remember what that budget, the austerity budget jammed through the legislature meant for the prime minister. His government was vacated in a no-confidence vote only days later.
Yeah, Michel Barnier is out, and now we know the name of the person who is in. It was announced by French President Emmanuel Macron, naming a centrist in Francois Bayrou, leader of the Democratic Movement Party. He'll be the new prime minister. The problem is you have a new face. They're still going to face the same issues.
This is very true. It is something that emerged this morning, Francois Bayrou, and we wanted to talk to Catherine Kleppinger about it, who joined us following the no-confidence vote and really helped us understand what was taking place on the ground. Professor of French Studies at George Washington University. Catherine, thanks for joining. What does this pick mean?
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, this is a really, I would say, both interesting and also somewhat predictable choice. If you had asked me, you know, who was my top guess, I would have said Francois Bayrou. He is, in a lot of ways, a political animal. He's been incredibly present on the French political scene for decades. He's actually known Barnier for 40 years, and he referenced that in his acceptance introductory speech today. A lot of French people probably remember him primarily for his 2007 presidential run, which to which he lost to Nicolas Sarkozy, but he was a very important third-party candidate at that point. He's been the leader of one of the main centrist, slightly right-leaning but still centrist parties for decades. He was also an early advocate of Emmanuel Macron's presidential ambitions, joining Macron's team as early as February of 2017. It also bears noting that he was one of Macron's initial ministers in 2017 as a minister of justice. He was obligated to step down a month later, however, because he has some legal troubles, and I can come back to that in a minute. But he has been in the inner circle ever since the beginning, and he is a close confidant to Macron. At the same time, he's also interesting because he's managed to toe a middle ground. He is not disliked, and I use the double negative intentionally in that he is able to work across the aisle. I'm not going to say that everyone loves him, but people don't immediately come out of the gate being ready to vote no confidence in him again.
Well, so I don't want to draw parallels that should not exist here, Catherine, or simplify to suggest that all democracies are similar. But we went through something here in the United States just a year ago where a Speaker of the House was ousted, and it was the candidate, Mike Johnson, ultimately, who was basically the one that no one seemed to have a problem with, even if no one outwardly liked him so much, that won. And despite attempts to oust him a few months into his speakership, there just wasn't the appetite to do it again. And I wonder, no matter who this next prime minister is, though obviously we know it is Mr. Bayrou now, if there's going to be appetite for another no confidence vote when the situation, arguably financially for France, could become quite dire very quickly.
Yes, and it's interesting that you mentioned that because Bayrou is a political animal, as I mentioned, and he actually saw this exact scenario coming. In an August 18th editorial in Le Figaro newspaper in France, he actually said that he thought the next prime minister, who turned out to be Barnier, would be faced with such a divided government that he would fall, and that there would need to be a subsequent prime minister who would actually be able to do things because the appetite would have been lost for the contest, protest vote. It has not been a secret that Bayrou has wanted this particular job for many years. He is now the fourth prime minister just since 2022 under Macron's second, presidential term. He seemed to have wanted this maybe a year ago, but maybe not quite so much this summer, specifically because, as you mentioned, he thought there was going to be a crisis that then would lead to the need to rebuild. And here we are.
How does Bayrou win over the left?
It's a really good question. And I think he's going to have to manage the reputation that Macron is bringing in with him. For one thing, it bears noting that La France Insoumise, which is the kind of furthest to the left party run by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, was not invited to the conversation, to the deliberations. The party has already said that they are going to move toward a no confidence vote. So he's got a big flank to the left that is already against him. He has, however, a long working relationship with several ministers of more kind of leftist leaning and socialist leaning persuasions. Several of those leaders, both from the socialists, the communists, as well as the French equivalent of the Green Party, have all come out and said they're not going to censure him right away. And that one big concession they want is a promise from him not to use recourse to this, I mentioned last time, 49.3 in the Constitution, which is essentially an executive order. So as long as Bayrou agrees not to push legislation through without consulting Parliament, they say they will continue to work with him. So that is, they've laid down their priorities. On the right side, Marine Le Pen has also laid down her priorities. She has, she says, we must revisit the question of retirement age. We have to be careful with Social Security and in particular medical reimbursements, that as long as he's willing to, play ball and truly consult with her on those things, then they won't proceed toward a no confidence vote. So it's an interesting moment where he's being incentivized to follow the parliamentary process, and a coalition of the center has agreed to support him if he's willing to do that.
So what's it going to take in terms of an actual budget, since that really was the issue for Barnier and is still going to be an issue for him, to make everybody happy? Is that even going to be realistically possible?
It's such a good question. I mean, France is on track to have a 6% budget deficit next year alone. And of course, EU regulations need limited at 3%. So France is drastically above where it needs to be. There were quite a few controversial measures in the Barnier budget. We mentioned last time some of the health insurance and Social Security benefits. Another thing that was in there that's being watched very closely is his educational policies, because Bayrou was actually a minister of education for 4 years in the 1990s. And he claims, and even in his acceptance speech today, he spoke very movingly about the importance of education for providing opportunities. And yet, and here's the and yet part, the Barnier budget actually proposed cutting 4,000 teachers out of their jobs as a budget-saving, maneuver. And so we see these, incredible divides between what everyone is hoping to promise versus what is possible. And I heard this exactly as you were speaking about the Trump budgets a few minutes before I came on. It's shockingly parallel.
No one has an easy time with budgets, I guess, at least in the West. Catherine Kleppinger, professor of French Studies at George Washington University. Thank you so much for joining us. I guess it does, help put things in perspective, Joe, no matter how broken the fiscal scheme seems to be here in the United States.
Indeed.
We are not alone in that.
We're not alone, but you're doing a good job connecting the dots here between these two really important stories and what it means for the U.S. relationship with France. France will find out, I guess, when the Trump administration moves back into Washington. We'll assemble our signature panel next. Rick and Jeannie are on the way in here, only on Bloomberg.
listening to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
Just 1 week to go until the government runs out of money. The funding deadline, the 20th of December. And we're counting down here, still without a plan. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Thanks for being with us on the Friday edition of Balance of Power. Friday the 13th, which means we've got a week until we run out of cash, right? So the question is, when we get a plan, there's talk it emerges this weekend. It might even come out of the Army-Navy gate if things happen properly.
Legislating from the suite.
Mike Johnson will be there, yeah, supposedly in the presidential suite. It's about kicking the can, right? And, you know, Sarah Chamberlain was interesting from the Republican Main Street Partnership on Balance of Power last evening, saying this might be shorter than some are suggesting. We'll be lucky maybe to get into February before there's another funding battle.
Yeah, well, we have to consider, first of all, that by the time we get to late February or early March, which is what we're talking about here, the fiscal year that these appropriations were supposed to address will be roughly halfway over. So even if we wrap this funding battle, pretty soon a next one is going to start. Keeping in mind, it's not just about deciding on a budget for this fiscal year and appropriating it to all of the different agencies and departments. It's also about raising the debt ceiling, trying to get a few, one, maybe two reconciliation packages passed with border, energy, and tax legislation. This is going to be a really heavy to-do list right at the beginning of the 119th Congress, keeping in mind that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is going to be working with a majority of what?
Could be one by the time that happens. And so you're hearing people suggest there's no shutdown in the works in the next week, but in the first quarter of next year is when we could really be running into some trouble.
Yeah, so let's get into this now with Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature political panel. Rick, of course, Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie, a Democratic strategist and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, we talk all the time, multiple times a year, about doing this song and dance all over again. We know the can is just going to get kicked down the road. They are choosing, though, to kick it down the road to March. Well, it will be maybe 2 months after Donald Trump takes office, with a lot he wants to accomplish in those first 100 days. So how problematic is this particular kicking of the can going to be ultimately for the Republican majorities in Congress and the president?
You know, I don't think it's going to be that big an issue on March 14th or whenever the new CR will expire, primarily because it's really in your rearview mirror at that point. As you pointed out, Kaylee, that's 6 months down the road in a fiscal year that hadn't had a budget approved yet. So it is a little silly, but the reality is that most of the effort in Congress by then will be focused on the next funding year's budget, and all the appropriations activity, all the authorizing will be for the 2026 budget. And so I do know that we've got more intensity in the Senate lined up. We've been talking all week about the 5-day work week in the United States Senate to really get things moving there. And I think that'll be matched to some degree by House tempo. And we've all been talking about the close margins of victory in the House and the Senate with Republicans in charge, and how much more complicated that'll make getting things passed. So that being said, yeah, I think as soon as they sign this CR, you know, before they get out before Christmas, that puts it in the rearview mirror. That buys you, as you point out, 3 months. And all of a sudden, you're focused on an entirely different set of numbers, new top lines. And I think it makes the reconciliation on 2024-25 really not that much more difficult.
Jeannie, some of the delay in crafting a short-term solution here has been the request for disaster aid following the hurricanes that blew through the Southeast. Reporting now suggests tens of billions of dollars in disaster aid will be included. The White House had asked for almost $100 billion. Knowing these are a lot of red states we're talking about here, when you're looking at North Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, and so forth, why the fight over the money?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's indicative of the fact that you do have a split in the House where you have obviously people who certainly, most representatives, if not all, want to fund these emergencies, but there's an awful lot of concern about the spending levels and the debt and deficit. And since it's a Friday, I got to disagree with Rick there. This is a disaster for Republicans. There is no way that you move this to March or February if it goes to February, and then it's clean sailing from there. Let's not forget, there is zero room for the House to maneuver on this. And so they don't have the numbers. There's a possibility that within the first 100 days, when you have Donald Trump and Republicans rightly anxious to move forward, a really, really energetic and a full agenda, that you have more Democrats on that House floor than you have Republicans on a given day. And so the idea that this is going to be smoother sailing when we go forward is not the case. They will have to fight this out next year. And the problem for Donald Trump, and I suspect he may give Mike Johnson an earful on this weekend, who knows, is the fact that he has an agenda that he has promised to the American public, and he is intent on living out that agenda. And you can bet if it doesn't get through, he's going to point the finger at Republicans in leadership for not pushing it through, because Democrats cannot be blamed, because Republicans by January own Washington, D.C.
Well, to that exact point, Jeannie, we have seen Democrats in this 118th Congress be the votes in the House to actually get a lot of things over the finish line, but they have been doing so knowing that the Senate and the White House were controlled by Democrats. That's not going to be the case now. So I do wonder if you think the Democrats are really going to play ball here at all, at least in the early days of the Trump administration. Well, there's still some degree of distance between what's taking place in the January to March period and the midterms in November of 2026.
Yeah, I think they absolutely will play ball, but playing ball means they will kick the ball and they will expect it to be kicked back. And so the question is, what are they going to get from Mike Johnson? Kaylee, I had to give you a sports reference on a Friday. But what
much
are they
appreciated. Army, Navy tomorrow. Go Navy.
That's right. What are they going to get in return for their support? They are going to expect something. And just listening to Donald Trump yesterday on the stock exchange, corporate tax cuts down to 15%. Those are huge, huge numbers for corporations, the 10 largest in the country. How are they going to make that work? Where are these cuts going to come from in spending? Democrats are in a position to say, you can't cut things that we hold important. And that means Mike Johnson, if he wants their support, he's going to have to deal with them. This is a really tough position for Mike Johnson, who I think has the toughest job in D.C. coming in January. And we thought the 118th was tough.
Yes, we did. But the interesting development there is that Mike Johnson appears to be here to stay. Rick Davis, that's changed a lot in the last 6 months or so, when obviously there was a little bit more concern about the veracity of the speaker following Mike Johnson's short tenure here. But he's really turned himself into a figure in the House in terms of a fundraiser and an organizer. Will that be challenged by having a majority of one?
Not really, because the one is actually Donald Trump. That is the majority that he has to abide by. The reality is he was the most powerful man in Washington last year. Aside from the President of the United States, he was the leading Republican voice in the nation. He was the Speaker of the House, and nobody else had that kind of power. Now, we are a hierarchical party. Republicans salute when the president is a Republican, and that's what's going to happen in the House of Representatives. You can't bake the cake the same ingredients that you had last year. This year, it's going to be different. When Donald Trump says, I want this bill passed, you're going to have almost complete fealty from Republicans in the House and Senate to do that, at least in the first year or two. And so I really don't think that you can gloom and doom it the way it was for 2 years under the Biden administration, because, you know, Mike Johnson, a very inexperienced legislator, thrust into the speakership without any high cover. You know, he's going to have plenty of high cover now. He's going to salute whenever Donald Trump says, this is the bill I want passed, and so will his coalition.
So that's the current speaker. I'd like to ask you as well, Jeannie, about a former speaker, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, we learned today, while on a congressional delegation trip to Europe, was hospitalized in Luxembourg after she sustained what was just described as an injury during an official engagement. We understand she's still working. We don't have further detail on what exactly the injury is or the severity of it. But keeping in mind here, the Congresswoman and Speaker Emerita is 84 years old. And this is just days after the 82-year-old outgoing Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell fell and also sustained injuries. What spotlight does this put on not only just the age of some of the most senior leaders in Washington, but whether or not they should still be in these positions at that age?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we wish Nancy Pelosi well. Like you said, we understand she's still working from the hospital where she's being checked out, and we hope she's okay. But I think we are seeing, just during this transition period for the administrations, we are seeing a transition in Congress. To your point, we have seen a number of more senior, both in age and in terms of their length of time in Congress on the Democratic side in particular, have stepped aside for their younger colleagues to take the reins of power. And I think that's critically important, because part of being a leader and part of being a party is that you make sure, and both parties have this, you make sure that your bench of incoming people and leaders are strong and they can take the reins. Otherwise, you are the risk. If you have the power and something, God forbid, happens to you, you are the risk to the entire party. And so we've seen the Democrats in particular the last few weeks do that. Interestingly, Pelosi seems to have been fighting against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for her ascension to the Oversight Committee. That said, we've seen a number of these transitions, and I think we're going to see more.
Of course, it's Hakeem Jeffries leading the Democratic conference in the House now. And Rick, he's going to be looking across the valley to the midterms for the next 2 years. How does he best position himself to win?
Best position, loyal opposition, raise enormous amounts of money. He'll be up against a fundraising juggernaut with the Republicans in the next 2 years. He's going to have to keep his eye on that, which means time away from the chamber. But yeah, I mean, he's probably going to have the typical historical cycle on his side. So, you know, it should bode well for him, but he's got to be organized enough to do it. And right now, you really have to wonder whether the Democrats can rally around his leadership in the party to help facilitate that, because it's pretty segmented and bifurcated right now.
Quickly, Rick, the Army-Navy game, of course, tomorrow. We understand there is quite a list of attendees. Who is the most writing on their visits with Donald Trump with the football game as the background here? Ron DeSantis, Mike Johnson, the speaker we've been talking about, or maybe Pete Hegseth if he decides to show?
Yeah, there's a big debate going on in Congress about how to facilitate the first year of Donald Trump's legislative agenda. John Thune is saying a two-step process, split up things and pass them in parts. And House Ways and Means Chairman is saying, I want one big package, up or down vote. That could be the most important decision that comes out at halftime.
All right. Well, we'll be monitoring Truth Social and I guess our television screens as well. Right? This is going to be like when Taylor Swift goes to a Chiefs game.
Exactly. They'll have a camera on the box the whole time.
Yeah. All right. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature political panel. Thank you so much. I feel like I should go to Maryland tomorrow and watch the game. I'm a Navy fan, you know.
Well, of course. But $1,200 will get you in, I think, at this point, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not cheap. It should be exciting.
It looks better on TV, especially when you're in the stadium we're talking about. Beautiful Landover, Maryland. We better get out of here. Natasha Hall is on the way in next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
Happy Friday from Washington, D.C. I'm Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew as we round out another week in politics, but also, of course, in financial markets. And they actually intersected quite a bit this week, and quite literally so yesterday when we saw the president-elect Donald Trump ringing the opening bell on the New York Stock Exchange, keeping in mind his affinity for using the stock market as a benchmark, not just when he's in office, but also when he was campaigning, as we've seen. And it's interesting as we are in this final trading period of the year, whether or not Santa Claus is going to come to town in time for the new president to come to the White House.
Well, yeah, that's so, I guess the question at this point is the Santa Claus rally already in the bag? Did he show up early? Because we're seeing a little bit of weakness in the markets, nothing to write home about, but it's not exactly the melt-up that we've been hearing about. Abigail Doolittle is watching the markets for us, Bloomberg Markets correspondent at World Headquarters in New York. What do you make of the, I guess, lack of movement today, Abigail? This isn't exactly a Santa Claus rally we're looking at.
Today's not really a Santa Claus rally, you're right. Very small moves, volume about 6% below the 20-day average for the S&P 500, which right now is down fractionally. On the other hand, the NASDAQ 100 up 0.5%. This having to do with Broadcom, not just earnings. The earnings picture was a little bit mixed, but looking forward, they're talking about huge AI demand. So that stock up about 20% on that forecast at a record high. Relative to December and the year, though, it has been all about, I guess, a 2024 rally. We have stocks up more than 25%. You have Bitcoin rallying back above $100,000. You have commodities doing fairly well. On the week, the dollar's doing well. Yields are higher. That, of course, means bonds are lower. Now, the big thing for next year, of course, will be the incoming Trump administration. And because we have had this big rally into anticipation of what's expected to be his pro-economy, pro-growth, protectionist policy that should help the economy, and therefore the stock market, as Kaylee was insinuating or talking about earlier in terms of the rally for stocks, in January, will it be a sell the news moment, or will the rally continue, or something in between? From a technical standpoint, the charts suggest this rally is getting a little bit long in the tooth, so maybe we see some kind of a pullback before maybe then there's a keeping going of the rally, although, of course, we don't know that, but that would be reasonable given this year's massive rally.
Well, and there's still a few more catalysts on the horizon. You have a Fed decision next week, and then after they make that rate decision, there is going to be their key inflation gauge 2 days later with the PCE deflator.
That's exactly right. So the Fed next week, it seems, is pretty much baked in terms of a cut. One thing that's happening, though, is on the week we have the 2-year yield up more than 12 basis points. The 10-year yield is up sharply. A lot of this having to do with talk from bond traders that the Fed might be on pause next year. So that's a big change in terms of the idea, or at least early next year instead of cuts. And then following that Fed meeting will be the PCE indicator. So long as PCE comes in roughly where it's supposed to, it's not wildly worse, which would mean much higher, or wildly better, much lower. It probably is not going to be too much of an influence. At this point, we are in December, and the Santa Claus at rally officially is toward the end of the month and the beginning of January. But most Decembers after the S&P 500 in the 11 months before is up more than 25%, well, there's a gain. So it seems right now we're on track for that. I will point out, though, those small cap stocks, the ones that should really be benefiting from potential Trump administration being protectionist, they are down for a second week in a row, down pretty sharply. In fact, the worst week since November 15th. So that's something to keep an eye on. That's a divergence between big tech on the one hand going higher, as we've seen, and then small caps going lower. I think some Trump market fans would say that small caps should be benefiting, and that has not been the case this month.
Oh, I understood. Abigail, while you're with us, just in our remaining moment here, speak to the seasonality. We never got the correction a lot of people thought we would see in the fall, going through September, October. The markets just seem to keep chugging ahead. The whole carry trade sell-off on August 5th is like it never happened, a thing of the past. Are we simply because we haven't seen a correction in so long, setting ourselves up for something in January.
It's an interesting point that you're making here, Joe, and that is what the charts are suggesting in terms of being long in the tooth. The rally that we're seeing right now is coming on a bearish divergence, or something called an RSI. It's basically a momentum indicator. When it goes above 70, that's when the bulls are really getting excited. When it's below 70, they're less excited. Well, right now, with stocks near record highs, the RSI is lower than it was around the last big rally earlier this year. So that's not the way that it should be. It suggests that these bulls are getting a little bit tired. And again, the question is, will we see a little bit of a sell the news as President-elect Trump takes office and his policies begin to take more shape? There could be certainly some jittery action around that.
All right, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, senior markets correspondent in New York. Thank you so much. Certainly you're not seeing a ton of jitters today. We're basically going nowhere in the equity market. It's actually quite boring looking. A little bit more movement in the bond market. We're up a couple basis points on 2 and 10-year yields. And interestingly, you are seeing some movement in oil. Both WTI and Brent up about 1.5%. We're still hanging out in that like 71 range for WTI, 75 for Brent. But we do know the oil market has been locked in, not just on what's happening domestically, politically in the U.S., but also what's happening abroad as we've watched the Middle East get roiled by event after event after event. And yet the oil market seemingly staying more steady than you would expect throughout it.
Well, that's for sure. We talked to Bob McNally about that the other day from Rapidan, and Bob was making the point, this just has to do with simple math and numbers of barrels on the market. Until that changes, nobody's going to be making any really big bets. But you're right, Kaylee, WTI, West Texas Intermediate crude, just above $71 a barrel here as we keep our eyes on what's happening in the Middle East, where our Secretary of State is traveling right now.
Yeah, Antony Blinken is abroad, as is Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. They're visiting this region. It was Blinken today who was in both Jordan and then Turkey, talking about not just the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, but also, of course, Syria, as we are just, barely a week out from the ousting of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. And that is something he was talking about with Erdogan and Turkey specifically, because Turkey will have a role to play, presumably, in what happens in Syria next. So we want to get into all of this and turn to Natasha Hall, who joins us from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she is a senior fellow at the Middle East program. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Natasha, if we could focus on Syria first. As I said, it's been really only a matter of days since Assad fled to Russia. There's obviously efforts around a transitional government in place. How do you assess how it's gone so far since the rebels successfully got Assad out?
Thank you for having me in this historic occasion, I would say. I mean, it's really been momentous to see a regime that has held on to power for so long, over half a century, and then throughout a 13-year brutal civil war, to really fall within the course of less than 2 weeks. So we're not so far out from it, from the fall of Assad and his refuge in Moscow. But certainly there's a lot of insecurity in the region right now. A lot of people are nervous about what this might portend for the future. But Syrians are jubilant. They feel like today is just a day for the future that they never thought would be possible, frankly, and that it could potentially turn a positive leaf for a country that has been through so much devastation. That said, the group that led the charge is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a designated terrorist organization. So many Syrians are also wary as well, but aware of all of the hard work that needs to happen to get to a better place that they had, dreamed of for so long.
So, Natasha, how long will it take, and what will be the signs that you're looking for to see a government that the United States can, in fact, have a relationship with?
I mean, that's a great question, and I think the next few weeks and months are really critical for many reasons. Within the country itself, we want to see more positive signs from HTS. They have given reassurances to religious minorities, for example. They've kept government employees in their posts for the most part. So it's been relatively bloodless, which is great to see for a country that has suffered so much. But what we really need to see in a country like Syria that has been just economically devastated, 90% of the population is under the poverty line, is we really need to see a rise in basic services, a rise in basic salaries. Your average government employee gets paid $25 a month. And we know with desperation breeds discontent, and discontent can lead to, potential, greater insecurity, infighting, and terrorism. So I think that the United States has a really positive role to play with the designation it has on HTS and its sanctions to be able to steer Syria towards a better future and hopefully a more hopeful one.
It also raises the question, Natasha, of the role that other U.S. adversaries could play in this. Russia and Iran, as we've talked about, were also dealt blows by the downfall of Assad. And I do wonder, the circumstances that you were describing do seem, if in the worser case scenarios, ones if there are unrest, that Iran might be able to take advantage of, even if it does find itself more weak in this moment. So how does the U.S., the new Syrian government, whatever it is, and others in the region, including Turkey, need to behave here to make sure that Iran stays down, if you will?
Right. I mean, this was truly a humiliating defeat for both Iran and Russia, who have been stalwart allies of the Assad regime. This rebel offensive was essentially possible because of a regional breakdown in power, where you saw Iran and its proxies really decimated. And Iran's forward defense strategy in tatters. It'd be difficult to see how they mount any kind of positive campaign in Syria at this time. That said, what we have seen in recent days was the Syrian Democratic Forces, this is the group that the U.S. backs, taking control of a really critical border crossing called Abu Kamal, which Syria shares with Iraq. This is a key part of the conduit of the sort of Shia crescent between Tehran and its proxy Hezbollah on the Mediterranean. And Syria is really key to that strategy and that arms shipment sort of corridor. So, I mean, if we see the U.S. troops, for example, pull out, as we've seen President-elect sort of allude to, saying that there's no U.S. interests in Syria, we could see the emergence of potential spoilers from Iran, but also ISIS as well.
Well, so where should, if you were looking forward here to make the most strategic decisions, Natasha, where should U.S. forces be positioned, Iraq or Syria?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think in an advisory role, remaining in Iraq would be pretty critical to U.S. security. But really, the 900 troops that are in Syria are a lot of bang for one's buck, let's say. It's a very limited presence, but it's kind of a wedge to prevent insecurity from rising from ISIS cells to really reemerge in a serious way. And again, to prevent Iran from sending arms shipments and militias back through that corridor. So I would think that, first and foremost, leaving U.S. troops in place, but on top of that, to really have a kind of stabilizing presence for the country. We've already seen a U.S. brokered ceasefire in the north between sort of Turkey and Turkish-backed groups and the Kurds. We need to see more of that in the months ahead to prevent greater insecurity during this really fragile moment. And then, as I mentioned, with sanctions and the terrorism designation on HTS, there really needs to be a checklist in terms of behavior, transition to civilian governance, dissolving of militia groups for a broader, more unified Syrian military. And the U.S. really does have cards to play along with its allies in doing that. So I think that there's really, really concrete steps that I do hope the U.S. plays here.
Natasha, in our final 2 minutes with you, I also want to note that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, made a trip to Israel, where yesterday he suggested that he thinks there could be a deal between Israel and Hamas and a release of the hostages this month. And I wonder the extent to which you think there's credibility in that statement, or if this is misplaced optimism.
Right. I mean, we've, of course, been talking about this since this February, that there will be a ceasefire imminent in any moment. I do not know if Prime Minister Netanyahu would want to, at the end of the day, give President Biden the win here. He might be essentially waiting for President-elect Trump, which he hasn't been very secretive about, is his preferred candidate, and wait to give President-elect Trump the win. I could see that easily happening. If President-elect Trump can take this as a win, then maybe we will see it in the next month. But I have my doubts.
Natasha, it's great to have you back. You're always welcome here. Natasha Hall, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Middle East Program, Senior Fellow, a voice of experience helping us navigate these stories. It's good to see you, Natasha. Come back and see us soon. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. As we wind things down on the early edition, we'll be back at 5 p.m. Eastern Time with the late edition of Balance of Power, working our way into what could be a pretty important weekend here. All eyes on this football game to figure out, I guess, the congressional agenda, Donald Trump's approach to any number of issues, the transition, who might be the next defense secretary. That's a heck of a ball game.
Yeah, it could be apprenticey in that two potential defense secretaries, the one who actually has been nominated for it and the other who reportedly could be a backup if Hegseth can't get through. Both Hegseth and DeSantis, they're in the presence of the president-elect. I feel like this could get a little dramatic.
Yeah, it's going to be fun to watch. So,
just like Balance of Power,
Pop
we're
your
fun
corn.
to watch. Come
That's
back and see us at 5 on Bloomberg TV and radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg. Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. This is Friday, but it's also Friday the 13th.
What is that word every Friday the 13th you say? I forget what it is.
Oh, triskaidekaphobia.
Yeah, I was kind of expecting you to say that.
I used to live on what was technically the 13th floor in college, but they don't do that. They name it a different, but we had that as you walked off the elevator, a big sign that said triskaidekaphobia.
Hey, kind of a happy Friday the 13th to Broadcom.
Is
I would
it?
say.
Oh, yeah, I guess it is.
I would say, like, they're sort of like good luck charm, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, listen, soaring, and it is kind of the stock we are talking about, the company we are talking about today. And yet, while it kind of helped support the markets earlier, it's running out of steam, although I should point out the NASDAQ 100 is still holding on to about a 0.6% gain. So we're going to talk about all the magic that is Broadcom on this Friday.
Yeah, soaring following earnings, and yes, of course, the AI angle behind the enthusiasm. Shares of Broadcom up now 22%, Carol.
Yeah, I mean, on such a tear. On semis and AI, we've got a great deep dive onto basically the next maybe demand shock, because AI, it wants a lot of stuff, including it requires a lot of data, but it requires data centers, it requires more chips, more power. It's a lot, more of everything.
It's like a character from Willy Wonka who just wants everything.
More.
I think that was Veruca Salt, right?
This is the times we're living in, and we're finding out as much as we talk about it, there's going to be a lot of new demand constraints that we're going to be talking about.
Hey, also on our radar, Jeff Bezos, because he's feuded with the president-elect. He actually plans to meet up with him soon. He needs an assist when it comes to that space race with Elon Musk. We'll have Bruce Einhorn a little later on.
Elon will be in on that meeting. I'm just saying.
Listen, these two don't always see eye to eye. They're huge competitors when it comes to space. No question, SpaceX is just like destroying Blue Origin at this point. And Project Kuiper doesn't even hold a candle to Starlink right now. So
frenemies in technology and politics coming together on this story.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, we're also going to talk about an incredible story. It's today's Bloomberg Big Take. It's one of the most read stories. It's about human eggs, a premium commodity for a global fertility market, an incredible deep dive and a captivating dive. So we're going to get into that a little bit later on. But first up, let's talk a little bit about the trade, because we're definitely off our best levels of the session. We did see the NASDAQ 100 reaching a new all-time high for the second time this week. That was largely due to that surge in Broadcom, powering gains across the entire chip technology complex. But let's point out that the S&P, the Dow, and the NASDAQ 100 all off their best levels of the session.
Yeah, taking a look at the major indices right now, we do see the S&P 500 just down fractionally as we speak, but 60.47 is where it's traded. The NASDAQ composite just shy of 20,000 at 19,900, down 0.3%. Actually down, I should say. Just pretty much flat. That's orange. You don't see that every day, Carol.
No, exactly. And I'm just going to point out, if I look at the S&P 500, 368 names or lower. So we are seeing more of a risk-off trade today, despite what we got from Broadcom in the overall equity universe. We have a lot of names down. All right, as we just mentioned, shares of Broadcom, though, did give some juice to the trade, and it continues to soar. It's pretty much staying at its best levels of the session, as Tim mentioned just a moment ago, up 22%. The stock hitting a $1 trillion valuation for the first time after predicting a boom in demand for its artificial intelligence chips. So with what you need to know, we've got an incredible duo. We lean on them so much.
They're like the most popular guys today around.
I don't even know if they got any sleep. Man, I've just seen, every time I look up at Bloomberg TV or I look at the radio studio, they are talking to folks. Kunjan Sabani, Senior Semiconductor Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, and also with us is Ian King, U.S. Semiconductor and Networking Reporter at Bloomberg News. We are so lucky to call them ours, so we get to lean on them, both joining us from our San Francisco bureau. Ian, I do want to start with you. Broadcom's quarter. What is the nut that investors are so excited about? Is it the outlook? Is it the AI? What is it?
Well, I mean, I'm sure Kunjan will give you better analysis than I could, but really the report was kind of okay. The forecast was okay. But what happened on the call was that the CEO gave a long-term projection for its kind of most important AI product that is kind of off the charts. And that really got everybody very excited about the future of this company and kind of pointed to it as a whole different company in terms of the scale that it can achieve.
Kunjan, come on in here, because we spoke to you yesterday after the numbers came out. Shares were kind of all over the place. They actually fell for a second, but up about 2%. Nothing like what we're seeing this morning. Certainly there were some price targets that were raised, but it was all about what was said on the call, right?
Yeah, it was all about AI. I mean, just to put things in perspective, they're at 12 billion in AI revenues. I mean, beyond NVIDIA, when we look at the size of AI chip revenues, there's nobody else. Even AMD is lagging if you just look at pure AI numbers, right? And we've been talking about AMD for a while as the #2 GPU provider. When they gave out this guide, now estimates are going somewhere between 25 to 30 billions in 3 years. Again, that size of that growth for a company like this, that's something we have only seen happen just with one name so far.
So Kunjan, you know, and I know we talked about this with you and Ian, I believe yesterday, but I want you to put it out for the Bloomberg audience again. Where is Broadcom in the AI chip puzzle?
Yeah, so they have two big AI businesses. One is called the custom ASICs or the custom silicon, where they help these large cloud and hyperscale customers like Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft design their own chips, which we have seen a trend that everyone is adopting. And the second piece is the AI networking and connectivity. So think of the IOs, the basically highways and the pipeline that connects all of these GPU and CPUs together in the data center.
Hey, Ian, come on in here because as you point out in your story, Broadcom got to where it is today by making a series of acquisitions over the last few years. More acquisitions in the future, now that we're seeing the value of Broadcom continue to surge. Give us a brief history of how it got to where it is today and what you think could come next when it comes to acquisitions.
Yeah, I mean, Hock Tan started off this company by basically with the small division of what was spun off from originally HP years ago and sort of made this kind of sequence of deals where he got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then eventually even branched out into software. And now we've got one of the world's largest chip companies, and it's pretty high in the ranks of software makers as well. And as we learned yesterday, he's not finished.
You know, it makes me think about, you know, and I know, Ian, we've talked about this with you a lot, Kunjan too, just like what's going on with Intel, and then you look at some of these other chip companies. Having said that, I feel like we've started to talk about NVIDIA and people going after that. Who does, Kunjan, let me bring you back in here, who does Broadcom have to be worried about, or do they not have to be worried about? Is their position in a pretty good place ahead of maybe their competition at this point?
Yeah, so specific to AI, I mean, it has been usually a duopoly in this market between Broadcom and Marvell. Broadcom has usually held somewhere between, say, 60 to 80% market share. We think that's going to stay in the same range in the future. Again, Marvell is another up-and-comer here who is making strides with the same customers that Broadcom is announcing, or the same set of customers, I should say. So we expect these two to continue dominating the AI custom silicon and the AI networking space going forward.
Ian,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, Ian, come on in on that too, like how you see it in terms of, you know, what I asked Kunjan as well. How, if you have anything to kind of add to that.
Yeah, no, that was a key part of the call yesterday. Yeah. I mean, they gave this market size as well, maybe as much as 90 billion, and people were like, okay, so you've got these two new customers that you're not telling us who they are. How does this all factor together? Is this happening on your existing customers? You've got two new customers. Are you going to have 100% of this? And all of these kind of flurry of questions. And Hock Tan was basically, the CEO was basically smiling and saying, well, there's room for everybody, but we think we're going to do quite well within that. And he's right. I mean, as Kunjan said, they are the best game in town, the kind of default choice. If you want a custom chip for your own data centers, you're going to go and ask them to help you to do it right now.
Yeah, we should note Marvell Technology up right now by 9.3% in sympathy with Broadcom's results. But Marvell, only about a $100 billion company, still about neck and neck when it comes to performance this year. Both companies up about 100% so far this year. Kunjan, weigh in on the idea of acquisitions moving forward for Broadcom. Ian mentioned that, and he mentioned in the story too, that this is a company that got where it is today as a result of making acquisitions. At Bloomberg Intelligence, are there any names that are on your radar about companies that could be acquired by Broadcom in the future?
Not at this moment. I mean, look, Ian answered it spot on. I also come originally from Broadcom. I was part of the acquisition when Hock acquired Broadcom. So, I mean, we do expect him to continue staying acquisitive. That's how he's really made his name. But when you look at the size of the past acquisition, each larger than the previous one, they don't tend to go and do small tuck-ins, right? So I think at this moment, like Ian said, they are going to focus on paying down debt first and then start collecting a bigger pile of cash, which they can then go out and do a bigger deal. Now, when you think about candidates with that size, there's not a lot left in the semi space, and regulation, at least in the semis so far, has not been as generous.
Hey, so Kunjan, wait a minute. Did you just drop a ball on us? Like, did you work for Broadcom? How did we not know this?
I did. In my past life, I was an engineer, and I used to work for Broadcom.
So what do we need to know? Any inside stories here?
Not anymore.
Fair enough, fair enough. Hey, guys, one of the things I thought about after this quarter, and this is what we do, right? We get one earnings, and we get an outlook, and we get a call, and then we're like, okay, next quarter. So, Ian, does what we got from this company make the next quarter or next couple of quarters even tougher in terms of expectations?
He was very careful to set expectations appropriately and said, look, these are just big customers, and these big projects take time, and they are, frankly, lumpy. So that's why they gave this 2027 target. And then he kind of gave us sort of a soft target for the whole of next year, which wasn't a massive increase from, sort of 15 to 20 in terms of the available market. It was very vague, but there was some very careful signaling there to sort of say, hey, look, you need to keep your eyes on the long-term growth potential here, not get sort of too tied up in the quarterly sort of machinations that we're going to see going forward.
We never do that. We never do that. Kunjan, just saving you 20 seconds here. How are you thinking about what's going to be on your radar when it comes to this company in particular?
I mean, like Ian said, I don't think investors should look at this quarter to quarter. I think we've just gotten a bad habit of what NVIDIA has set a precedent. I mean, these are, again, handful of customers, like you can count on your one hand, right? Their buying patterns will go through, which is very normal, through some kind of timing and digestion. So we should look at it, again, from a year-to-year milestone post.
All right, some good advice, because it's true. We get kind of caught up in day-to-day stuff, and sometimes you have to do the longer-term perspective. Guys, thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend. Kunjan Sabani, Senior Semiconductor Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, along with Ian King, U.S. Semiconductor and Networking Reporter at Bloomberg News. Incredible on the space, both of them, and joining us there from our San Francisco Bureau. So that is really the latest on that standout stock of the day, no doubt about it.
Yeah, on that, though, the AI craze, it feels like it's all we talk about because, well, it is. The headlines certainly have been nonstop. Our weekend broadcast and podcast devoted to it. Check that one out. It drops tomorrow. It brings us to a story that is among the most read on the Bloomberg today. And the story kicks off with this, quote, "It looks easy enough. Ask ChatGPT something and it responds. But pull back the curtain and you'll find that every ChatGPT prompt and Microsoft Copilot task consumes vast resources."
I love it, right? I want to know more. That drawdown on resources is what we wanted to hear more about. With more, we turn to Bloomberg News Managing Editor of Technology and Global Cybersecurity, Lynn Dewan. She is with us in New York City. Lynn, good to have you here. So appropriate on a day when we're so focused. AI, Broadcom, all of this stuff. A lot of us are playing around with ChatGPT. Walk us through every query or ask what's involved, what are the demands on the system?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I will back up by saying that this piece that we wrote about what I'm calling the AI supply chain was inspired by one conversation that I had with one of our AI reporters at Bloomberg, Rachel Metz. About a year ago, we met, and she said something along the lines of like, these chatbots are like the Wizard of Oz, right? It looks like magic. It just writes poetry. It makes movies, but then you pull back the curtain and they're like, a million people pulling on levers, tinkering with the models. And not just that, to your question, it's, gigawatts of electricity that can power entire nations and Olympic-sized pools of drinking quality water. And all the chips in the world, as Ian is laying out in the Broadcom AI boom, and millions of people, as I said, and copious amounts of data and metal and minerals and fossil fuels like coal and oil and natural gas. So, if there was any takeaway from the piece that I wanted readers to have, it is that AI is not magic. It's incredibly resource intensive. And like we as a society need to start thinking about how much in resource we are willing to dedicate to this technology.
Is it always going to be this resource intensive, or is this because we're in the early days of these LLMs? And I mean early days, like, for me, it's early days. I know these companies have been working on them for quite a while. But does this stuff get more efficient as we figure out how to make it more efficient?
I'm glad you caught yourself there, because large language models have been around for years. That being said, one of the points that we make as like a to be sure in that piece is the fact that there is now this growing obsession of making these LLMs and constructing them and maintaining them more efficient, not just from like the actual building of the models that power tools like ChatGPT and Microsoft Copilot, but also even like right down to the chips that help come with the compute of them. So like you have, you know, Jensen Huang over at NVIDIA and AMD talking a lot about reducing the energy that it takes to run these chips and making them as efficient as possible. For this very reason, everybody is waking up to the fact that it takes a lot of resources because it is not as efficient as it can be.
So land, internet, people, water, chips, metals, good data, like all this stuff, this demand. I mean, we talk about chip wars, right? We talked with
Chris Miller yesterday.
Chris Miller, right? Wrote a book 2 years ago about it. And increasingly we see tariffs, trades, you know, when it comes to semiconductors, we consider it a national security issue at this point. So who is best positioned? Is it the U.S.? Is it China? Is it that the world's going to need each other in order to really kind of dig down and be able to offer up all the AI that seems to be in demand, or we expect to be in demand in the future?
There is certainly a narrative among the tech companies that now is the time to establish allies for AI resources, to think about who the U.S. trusts and wants to partner up with, because there is this acknowledgement that there aren't enough resources here in the U.S. or in China or in Israel or in the UK or in Brussels to create like an AI superpower on their own. So like, you know, there's a lot of talk around pooling of resources and AI sovereignty for that reason. You raised an interesting point about the chip wars, and I think that this piece establishes that it's not just going to be a war over chips, it's going to be a war over water. You're already seeing it play out in some places like Spain and in Latin America. There's going to be a war over electricity, as Nextera hinted to in saying all boats are rising with the tide. People are already trying to like lock in future electricity supplies, knowing that these big tech companies are going to grab all of them for AI. Right. So I think, you know, you're going to see a lot of these resource wars play out.
What about when it comes to the data and the good data? Because I think that's something that oftentimes gets lost on. It's something Adobe loves to talk about this week with the stock falling and with earnings. We spoke to an executive there yesterday. Just in 30 seconds, the data that this is trained on. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the explanation that we have in the piece about the data and the need for it is these AI models need data like human beings need food. The way that they advance is by consuming more and more volumes of, as you say, good data, high quality, clean data, in order to become smarter and smarter. And the world has like a finite source of clean, well categorized data. And the people who own that kind of data, like Bloomberg per se, or financial institutions, media organizations, content creators, are waking up to the fact that that data has more and more value. And you're seeing like a grab of that data too, with a lot of AI companies signing contracts with data providers.
The idea though that the abundance of data may actually slow down the development of AI because it's not yet maybe pure enough for what we need. Linda Wan, a killer story, Bloomberg News managing editor of Tech and Global Security. Coming up, human eggs, a new commodity.
listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week on this Friday, December 13th, live here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. Just a reminder, we've got markets definitely off their best levels of the session. The NASDAQ 100, which hit a record earlier in the day, still holding on to about a 0.7% gain, largely led by the rally that we've seen in Broadcom. We talked about that earlier in the broadcast. But again, we're seeing more of a risk-off trade when you broaden out. But nonetheless, off our best levels, I think safe to say we're market time a little bit ahead of next week's Fed meeting. All right, we do want to get to today's Bloomberg Big Take. It's a story that is part of several on the global fertility industry that our Bloomberg News team has been looking into. To tell it, it took an editorial village of Bloomberg reporters. The tale, the reality, included following a teenage girl in India lured into selling her eggs, a model in Argentina whose genetic makeup is prized, a mother in Greece told by police that her eggs were stolen, and 2 egg girls from Taiwan who have put themselves at risk to earn money in the United States. We had a lot of questions, and I bet so do you.
Yeah, so stop what you're doing because you want to know more. The entire read, it is a long one. It is worth it, and it is with good reason. It can be found on the Bloomberg terminal and at bloomberg.com/businessweek. Here with us is Bloomberg Business Week senior investigative reporter Susan Burfield in our Los Angeles bureau. Susan, we're living in really interesting times because the whole idea that this medical process can be undertaken is actually relatively new here. Let's take a step back and just give us an idea of the fertility industry here in the U.S. globally and what it is, how big it is, and then we'll get into some of the details in the story.
Yeah, thanks so much. So the fertility industry globally is worth about $35 billion, and it's growing. And, that's in part because there is new technology, that allows eggs in particular to be frozen, to be stored, to be transported, and to be transplanted. And at the same time, as probably a lot of people know, women are delaying having kids, and that makes it harder to get pregnant, and that's because human eggs decline in number and quality in a woman as she ages. And so that is one reason that the demand for eggs from younger, fertile women has been growing. And that's what we set out to try to capture. Who's providing those eggs, who's buying those eggs, and how the flows work transnationally.
All right, so I am curious about how you guys went about finding these individuals. And when you talk about, eggs when you're younger, being much more productive, right? This story gets into, though, tapping into or accessing very young women, girls, right, to get access to their eggs. I mean, this has become a commodity, and as you guys say, a premium commodity.
Yeah, I think, one way to think about this, and it probably, makes some people uncomfortable, and I think that's fair, because this is a really emotional issue where people, especially, those trying to get pregnant, are at their most vulnerable. These aren't easy decisions to make for anybody involved. But, what we found is that because there is an increasing demand for eggs, you could consider them, a very precious and scarce resource. And as with any resource, that presents opportunities for both people to benefit, and by that I mean both the women who voluntarily sell their eggs to make money, to help people, obviously the would-be parents who are getting the eggs and the chance to have a baby, but it also presents opportunity for exploitation. And that's also what we documented. Well, and when you're talking about young girls, that's what you're talking about.
Exactly, and I want to get into, and to be fair, I think we've all been on a subway and seen the posters that said, you can sell your eggs, essentially. And we were actually having a conversation in the newsroom around your story. So to be fair, there's a legal, everything's on the up and up, and then there's some that you get a little bit questionable. Let's go into, because it does seem like often when we're looking at, tapping a precious resource, it often leads us to emerging markets. And that's one of the things that struck me about this story, because this does as well.
That's right. So, what we found is that for some clinics, for some parents, for some agents, the people who are connecting these donors. We call them donors, though, most of them are getting paid, but the term the industry prefers is donors. And, because people can make money selling their eggs in the US and elsewhere, it opens up the possibilities for what you could say is like economic coercion. And I think what we were trying to look at is, how does that play out in countries where, both the chance or the necessity to sell your eggs can bring more money than women might be able to make in lots of other ways. And that brings a pressure that, we wanted to explore.
Can you talk a little bit about how the story opens and the one of the first chapters about a young girl in India and her story, and then we can talk a little bit about how this story totally spans the globe and the Bloomberg newsroom and how a global newsroom is able to capture stories such as this.
Sure. So, the young, really teen, the teen in India who we write about, agreed to sell her eggs, but really was too young to understand what she was doing. Even still doesn't quite, understand that there, could be children out there who were born from her eggs. She, herself says that, she wanted a mobile phone and was offered a way to make the money by other women who were agents and who were recruiting women or young women like her to sell their eggs. And, this is, I think, a pretty egregious case. Teenagers are not supposed to be donating eggs in India, where she lives. The law requires women to be 23, but she was kind of recruited into a network of women, mostly, who had set up an entire way to almost fool the clinics. It was probably also incumbent upon the clinics to ask more questions than they might have, or to probe the answers a little bit more than they were getting from the young woman. But she didn't do this on her own. She was recruited into a network.
One of the other stories that you get to is, and I feel like this is where Bloomberg and Business Week does so well, is that you get very specific and you tell what has happened to these individuals. You talk about a woman in Greece, Maria, she goes by a pseudonym, but again, was harvesting eggs for herself, right?
That's right.
And then it turned out, she found out that wasn't just the case.
Yeah, this was, Maria, as you said, was seeking IVF treatment for herself. That included, as it often does, the kind of stimulation process that egg donors go through, which is, about 10, 12 days of regular hormonal shots to increase the number of eggs that a woman can produce, called superovulation. So Maria went through that, went through the retrieval process, which requires going under anesthesia, and her eggs were extracted. She was told that she produced a certain number of eggs, and ultimately she did give birth as a result of this extraction and the retrieval and the IVF. But later, she was told by the police that some of her eggs were given to another woman. And the clinic at the center of this is under an investigation. So Maria doesn't know and doesn't know who the woman is, doesn't know the result of it, but she knows that some of her eggs were given to another woman without her consent.
When I was reading this story, Susan, I was thinking about the different regulations in different parts of the world when it comes to this medical procedure. I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about medical procedures here. We're talking about drugs. And the way that the industry is regulated is different in many parts of the world. Here in the U.S., what do we look at with the regulatory environment, and what should people think about here in the U.S. who are listening to this, watching this, have read this story, when they learn about procedures such as these?
Yeah, like how do you trust your doctor
Yeah.
who is doing the extraction, he or she, to trust that they're just taking eggs for yourself?
Oh, well, so, as you said, different countries do have different regulations, both about what's allowed overall and, how donors are treated. In some places, in some countries, donors must remain anonymous. In other places, donors must be identified. In the U.S., the FDA does have some restrictions on who can donate and requirements for them. There is an industry trade group that puts forth guidelines for how care overall is supposed to be provided, how egg donors and sperm donors are supposed to be treated. What we found is that those are guidelines. They are widely accepted, but there isn't really a way to enforce those guidelines. So we don't want to suggest that the industry in the U.S. is dangerous in any way. What we were looking at is cases where there had been problems abroad, and just we want people to think about how this is all happening. Sometimes it's happening quickly. Sometimes as rules or circumstances change in one country, the entire market might shift to another country. And so I think probably we're all familiar with people who might travel elsewhere for fertility services. In part, maybe it's cheaper, in part because maybe they do have more access to eggs or to surrogates. And so, our aim is to kind of reveal this global network that exists, and to have people think about, where this most precious resource comes from and goes to.
Yeah, and forgive, we certainly no intention to be alarmist. It's just you read some of these stories, and you're right.
Yeah.
Like I think we all know, I know multiple people, right, who have certainly gotten an assist when it comes to having children, and it becomes like more the norm, if anything. Just got 30 seconds left here. How do you hope people read this story? And is it just kind of just think about because whenever there's money involved, there can be problems. Again, 30 seconds. What's your final thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what drew each of us to this story was the fact that this was, in our view, kind of untold and unexplored. That there is this very precious resource that comes from women, and that does, and that does present the opportunity.
So listen, Susan, we're going to let you go. I know we're having fire alarms. It's the way of our world. Sometimes it happens on a Friday. Sometimes it happens on a Monday. Susan Burfield, an incredible read. You and the gang. Bloomberg Businessweek senior investigative reporter Susan Burfield. Check it out. BloombergBusinessweek.com and on the Bloomberg terminal. Coming up next, we're going to get into the Bezos-Trump-Musk relationship. It's complicated.
listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, Bloomberg Business Week on Radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals on this Friday, December 13th. Carol Master along with Tim Stenivek. Again, looking at stocks just coming off their lows of this session, but we're looking at, call it unchanged on the S&P 500, just up a point. NASDAQ 100 certainly has been the outperformer. Thank you, Broadcom. You're seeing that index up 168 points, hitting a new record today. In the trade, up about 0.8%, but we're getting ready to wrap up the week, and we'll have those closing numbers a little bit later on. And then, of course, we're on to the Fed meeting next week.
Yeah, Broadcom up, Carol, 24.3%.
What's the valuation?
As we speak, over $1 trillion.
Yeah.
Marvell Technology up in sympathy, more than 10%
Think
right
they're
now.
celebrating a little bit today?
You know what else is up?
What's up?
Tesla.
Tesla.
A new record.
Well, that gets us nicely to our next story. Welcome to the world of frenemies, everybody. It happens in the tech world, it happens in politics, and this next story brings them nicely together, or maybe not so nicely. We will see, right?
With more, we welcome Bloomberg News space business reporter Bruce Einhorn from our Bloomberg Intelligence Princeton News Bureau. Bruce, Jeff Bezos and Donald Trump, tell us about this relationship, because it's very complicated, especially with Bezos owning the Washington Post, and then even going back to the president-elect's first term, where there was that lawsuit about that cloud contract and the Department of Defense and Amazon not winning it. What's going on here?
Yeah, this is in the news now because the president-elect yesterday said that he's going to be meeting with Jeff Bezos next week. And as you've just described, there is a lot to discuss. There's a lot of history between these two men. The lawsuit back from the first Trump administration was alleging that President Trump tried to have Amazon excluded from a Pentagon deal. In the court filing, Amazon alleged that the president had instructed the Secretary of Defense to, quote, screw Amazon. So there has been a lot of bad blood, I think fair to say, between them. But more recently, there have been conciliatory signs. The president-elect did say that he's meeting with Jeff Bezos. He did say that yesterday. For his part, Jeff Bezos has congratulated the president-elect on his victory. Amazon is giving some money for the inauguration, making a donation, I should say. It seems that there's effort to repair this relationship.
All right, I kind of get that. To be fair, Bruce, I mean, Elon and SpaceX, I mean, they've been doing fairly well even before the chumminess of Donald Trump and Elon Musk, right? So, I wonder how much of it is, Jeff Bezos and his space aspirations, they're not just doing as well, and that Elon fundamentally and SpaceX are, I don't know, I don't want to say a better company, but you know what I'm saying? That they are just kind of doing well even